Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second day of the Global Economic Policy Forum 2024, organized by the Ministry of Finance and the Confederation of Indian Industry. Our first session today, Sustaining High Growth, Drivers and the Unfinished Agenda. To open the session, I'd like to invite Mr. R. Dinesh, immediate past President CII and Executive Chairman TVS Supply Chain Solutions Limited, to give his opening remarks and take the session forward.
Thank you, Renuka. Good morning to all of you. Sri Sunil Barthwal, Secretary, Department of Commerce, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Janmay, Chairman, India, BCG. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today on the first session of the second day of this Global Economic Forum. We have had the good fortune of listening to many good speakers yesterday, and continuing that trend, we are now trying to decipher how do we sustain the growth which especially the Global South looks forward to, what are the drivers and the unfinished agenda, and of course, we will be focusing on India to start with, but obviously many of these are applicable across the world. We know today that India is at an inflection point, and obviously we are still the fastest growing economy, but there is many more things to be done. And as we look forward to the next decade, it is important to deliberate on the issues, acknowledge that we are facing a very different world, and how do we look at the progress forward in this growth journey is something which we will cover today. I don't want to take too much of time in introducing the topic or introducing the speakers. All of them are eminent in their own way, so I won't get into the details of that. But from the biggest drivers of growth going forward, one focus would be on the next generation policy reforms. And that's going to happen not just at the country level, but across, especially with the states. And how do we make sure that the implementation is done by the required consensus being built? Secondly, garnering private sector investments. A comprehensive, broad range of steps are necessary for unlocking private capital even further for financing this growth. This will also create the necessary fiscal space, and obviously deepening the financial market becomes a core focus in that. Lastly, trade is obviously the largest propeller of growth. Historical evidence has proven that with a significant increase in the share of trade, it increases the rate of growth. The share of GDP, trade in GDP, rose from 32.3% in FY05 to 40.8% in 23. But going forward, how do we navigate this uncertain world, and how do we ensure that we are able to bring together the convergence of the industrial, investment, and trade policies with the necessary funding required to support all of this is something which we hope we will not only cover in this session, but also have takeaways for us for implementation in future. With that, I would now like to invite Janmay to give his remarks and then follow up with the others. Janmay, over to you. Up to you, whichever you choose.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to surprise both the Commerce Secretary and the Chief Economic Advisor, because all the suggestions I will give for next generation reforms will not focus on their ministries, because I attack their ministries often enough, so I decided from this stage I'll just be nice to them. But I'll still pick up 5 areas of policy reform which, to my mind, I think are critical going forward. The first is water. I think one of the areas that India needs to fix going forward is water. And if I was to go from hardest to fix to easiest to fix, the hardest to fix will be pricing water. Then, cleaning the rivers and sewage treatment plants, then cities and the municipal corporations and what they do with leaking pipes and where they set it up and how they invigorate tanks and ensure that Indian cities are not just a plastic sheet. And then what we do with rainwater and what we do with planting trees. And then actually what we do with introducing this as a curriculum in schools. So, it's easiest to, of course, introduce it as a curriculum in school, which will have a long-term benefit. But the hardest, of course, will be starting to address pricing of water, which makes us grow rice in Punjab and sugar in Vidarbha. So this is a problem of such severity that it can actually challenge the republic. States will become so water-starved that it will become an issue of great urgency and importance, and it needs to be addressed in terms of a mission mode, so to speak. The second area I will pick is picked very often, but my suggestion is to look at education differently. We've been talking about teachers training, more schools, better facilities for the longest time. What can we do to supplement these efforts in a manner that can allow us to address the urgent crisis in primary education and adult education in India? If we are to use the fact that we are a population with an average age of 29, and in fact the next 2 billion people the world will come from South Asia and Africa, we owe it to the world to have a better workforce. So what may we do? And, can there be a way of at least providing short-term fixes to education? There would be about 18 million children at the age of every year from 10 to 20, So can we decide to find a way to subsidize and give them a computer in a location in every village and every Mufassil town, to have one place which has power all day long, and it has a safe space where people can sit and get Wi-Fi access, and for a certain set of programs they don't get charged for data, so that all the learning programs are free. If they want to play on the computer, that's fine, then they have to pay for the data. And in fact, it at least starts dealing with people to start learning how to use a computer. And many of them might actually find some of the courses available on YouTube, etc., to be such that they can self-learn. So this would be my second reform agenda. The third would be what we have done in just an unbelievable way. The digital public infrastructure stack of India is world-beating. It sets the global standards. And it has so much power and so much potential that it is actually the envy of the world for those in the world who know about it, and those who are ignorant, well, they can't envy us of something that they're not aware of. But can we create the healthcare technology stack in the same way that we have done in financial services and payments, and actually take this down? And then, we will find a strange situation where the health data of the poor in India will be better than the rich. Because all of us don't even have the prescriptions that have been written in a handwriting that we can't read, So this would actually change if we could actually have a healthcare stack which becomes such that the records become available, and then we can use it in ways which will allow us to do many more things with the data that we have in healthcare. The fourth area I want to highlight is contract enforcement. Whether we take appellate bodies or we take our courts, and I don't want to even talk about the lower judiciary because it's so bad. we really need to fix contract enforcement in India, because contract enforcement is the threat of taking somebody to court, because it will take 20 years there, to get any civil case adjudicated. And without good contract enforcement, the market doesn't function efficiently. And we really need to address this in a manner which is a joint party effort, which we can actually start taking this on. So all the appellate bodies are clogged up and all the courts are clogged, and the lower judiciary is under enormous pressure. And you can't blame the lower judiciary, because the pressure is there in the political system. It is not there in just this wing. It is the country that we are in. But it does create a certain a lack of basic civil society in some ways, which is very necessary for India as we grow. And then the last area I will pick up is digitization of land records. This has been on the agenda forever. So when we talk about next generation reforms, we don't have to have new ideas. We need to just get the stuff that is not done. So digitization of land records will free up so much capital that we can't even imagine. And there is a phenomenal book that Hernando de Soto had written, long ago, and it's still as relevant today as it was then, about missing capital. And so for many people in the country, their only capital is land. And the nature of land records are such that they can't use it effectively to raise money or to actually dispose it if they have to. And the process is slow and variable and open to challenge. So these were the 5 I picked up. These are not the only 5 that are needed in India. There are many others. But we know most of what has to be done. And I just want to end with what one German politician told me recently. I was in a discussion with him and I was asking him a few questions about Germany and why their labor rules are so bad and how difficult it is to get business done in Germany. So he said, we all know what to do, that's not the problem. We just know that if we do what needs to be done, we won't get re-elected. So that does constrain us. And that is a ever real threat in all democracies. And we need to recognize it as I make these comments from the outside, because it's easier to say these things than to do these things. But I'll give 1.5 minutes back to the other eminent speakers on the panel.
Thank you, Janmay. I really appreciate your opening comments. But I think I just also wanted to clarify, you did say that you're not going to cover anything which is on the agenda for this, but you did cover many of the next generation reforms, if I can say so. So at least you did lead to it. Now I will move forward to Dr. Anantanageshwaran. I think you have a presentation, so you may please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chair. Really grateful to Janmay for setting the stage by focusing on issues which are not necessarily, not all of them, some of them are, which are not on the front pages, but which matter. And in some sense, therefore, what I'm going to say complements or even supplements what he said. So right now, the attention is far too much on what happened in the second quarter of the fiscal year, July to September. So I'm starting with that very briefly. It is not that we think that the second quarter slowdown is purely a data artifact, and as more data come in, it would automatically be upgraded. Numbers would be revised higher. Or for that matter, it could be a simple seasonal factor because of rains, because of some religious observance in September, etc. It could be either of them, or it could also be something more fundamental as the ability of the state to spend what is budgeted, and also what is going on post-COVID in the private sector in terms of hiring and compensation, etc., which may also have a longer-term bearing on urban household income, consumption, and savings patterns compared to what we had before COVID. So there could be any number of factors, and we are at this stage not necessarily ruling them out, that they could be very temporary, or they could be mundane, or something more serious. But nonetheless, I think the fact remains that we will be on track to achieve the kind of growth numbers that we had penciled in the economic survey in July, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 for the whole financial year. But that is not the focus. The focus is to how to make sure that we grow at a sustainable rate in a world that is going to be extraordinarily difficult, as we heard yesterday from many speakers, which we are aware, because I think it is not fully appreciated that the last 40 years of paradigm of globalization, continuous rise in trade volumes, free movement of goods, people, capital, etc. All those things are going to be not necessarily possible with the same felicity with which we got used to them. And then geopolitics is fragmented, and more importantly, the agenda of emission mitigation is also a huge overhang on developing countries in terms of balancing their economic aspirations and climate change management. So at the moment, what we are happy about the fact is that on the right side, what you see is that capital formation as a share of GDP was 27.3% pre-COVID, and because of balance sheet issues in the private sector, and now it has increased to 30.8%, a 3.5 percentage point increase, largely because of government-driven public investment. But I must add that the private sector is also beginning to deploy its capital with the much better balance sheets, much better profitability, and that we think will continue. So in that sense, we do see this number heading towards the mid-30s in the course of the next 5 years. The point I made earlier about the global situation was evident even in the second quarter. That there was a spike in global uncertainty. There was a spike in global supply chain disruptions because of the war in Middle East or the conflicts in Middle East and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, etc. But please believe me that it is not something that will be something temporary. As I mentioned in the next 5 on the left side, these are going to be enduring challenges, and we need to accept them. And that is what will also dictate what the trend growth will be. It will not be something similar to what we experienced between 2003 and 2008, but something lower. That is because of factors beyond our control. Because with all our imperfections, between 2003 and 2008, in fact, there were even more imperfections than now, we could achieve 8 to 9% growth in real terms for 5 years between 2003 and 2008. Because the global environment was far more conducive. And therefore, we cannot take that for granted. And that means we have to double down much more on our domestic efforts. And that is why I'm happy Janmay spelled out some of the areas which are not necessarily in the top of our consciousness. And what you see is that we have listed down, and since it is a little too far, and that is why Dinesh moved to the other side of the stage, and there is no computer here for me to see it very clearly, there are 5 different areas, whether it is MSMEs or agricultural sector or investment in quality and R&D, and continued investment in not only in infrastructure but other areas. These would be important challenges. As Janmay mentioned about things that are not necessarily taken into consideration in normal discourse, we also feel that innovation and a focus on quality and employment and wage growth are also not given as much importance as we speak about investment and deregulation and liberalization, etc. What you see on this slide is that the digital public infrastructure is something that we have done very well, but its potential is still untapped. It is not just a means to improve financial access, although that is a very important component of DPI, but it is also a repository of data. And today, many countries consider the critical minerals and rare earths as precious resources. But India, with 1.4 billion people, will be generating a lot of data. And in the process, different commercial players inside the country and outside the country may be using it. And we need to make sure that the digital public infrastructure and the data they generate are put to use for public welfare purposes without compromising privacy and security, etc. And also to ensure that it captures development across the country, development across districts, and development within states and interstates, etc. There is so much that can be done with this data. And one of the examples he gave was about the health records, etc. But this is we are just begun to scratch the surface. And this could probably add at least 0.5 percentage point to the potential GDP growth in the country. These are the 5 different policy emphases. Again, this is not a complete list. What we think are important. The first one is critical, because textbooks will tell you, as countries grow, they move on to manufacturing and services. But I think in the world that we are living in and going to live in, agriculture should not be relegated to the past, but if anything, it should come back to the forefront, because there are going to be challenges in growing our manufacturing and services in the global context in which we operate. Therefore, agriculture is not only an important source of food security, but can also be a source of export and a strategic advantage. And we need to move away, therefore, from cereals, emphasis on cereals. We need to ensure water security, as he pointed out, and also provide the right incentives. We provide a lot of support to farmers, but as we wrote in the economic survey, if they are retailored and recalibrated to push them into areas where we can become more self-sufficient than where we are today, and also can be a source of export, this has a lot of potential. And employment and skill development is very well known. Small and medium enterprises, I think, well-meaning way, but with the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Unfortunately, our support policies for MSMEs over the years since independence have kept them small, robbing them of the incentive and the mindset to grow. So we should remove the fear of growth from MSMEs, that's important. And then quality consciousness, innovation in the private sector has to be a major part. Addressing climate change, my time is running out. Employment challenges that, according to the economic survey we wrote in July, we estimate that about 8 million jobs need to be created at the minimum every year. For the next 10 to 20 years, we captured the next 12 years here. It is not a trivial challenge, and not only that, we have to create these jobs with at least good minimum decent living wages at the minimum. So it is an important challenge, and one of the ways in which this can happen is, as I said, making sure that our micro enterprises become small, small become medium, and medium become large enterprises. And for that, the answer is deregulation, and threshold-based rules and concessions should be linked to economic activity rather than cost in absolute numbers. If they are linked to economic activity like GDP, they will constantly keep rising rather than set in absolute terms. Some of those absolute numbers might have been set in a different era. And as a country moves from $300 billion of GDP in 1993 to 3.6 trillion, those numbers are still too small for an economy that is on its way to becoming the 3rd largest economy. So threshold should not become tyrannical in terms of holding back growth. And that is what I think governments across the country, union and state, have to focus. Then I spoke about the importance of managing energy transition and energy security and affordability. One of the reasons why, relatively speaking, Europe is facing economic doldrums in the last year or so is, if you look at the rise in industrial electricity prices pre and post-COVID, most of the European countries have experienced a very huge increase in industrial energy costs, eroding their competitiveness, partly, not fully, partly because of the focus on renewable energy and energy transition. That is something we need to do carefully so that we do not throw the baby of economic growth out with the bathwater in the name of managing energy transition and tackling climate change. Without growth, there are no resources to invest for climate change management. And then same thing with domestic electricity prices in Europe, again, has been a major contributor to the sense of economic slowdown. And therefore, this is not only a political challenge, but also an economic challenge for not only India, but global South. And lastly, just capturing all this, generating productive employment, addressing the skill gap, tapping into the full potential of the agricultural sector, enhancing manufacturing and MSME through deregulation, energy security, balanced rural-urban development, continue to support high-quality capital expenditure, and making made in India synonymous with high quality through innovations, R&D, and quality consciousness. That is one thing that I have not included here. The focus should be also on mental health of India's demographic dividend. The prevalence of massive screen time, sedentary habits, and ultra-processed food consumption is making a whole generation anxious, depressed, and prone to suicidal thoughts. So we need to, this is not just a government responsibility, but responsibility of society and the private sector as well. If India has to reap the demographic dividend, Indians should not only be physically healthy, but also be mentally healthy, which is not listed here, nor did Janmay mention it, so I thought I should leave it as my concluding thought. But having said all of that, whatever you say about India, people say the opposite is equally true as well, right? And in other words, we shouldn't be overawed by the challenges. We have done it. We have grown from 6,000 rupees per capita income in 1993 to 2.12 lakh rupees per capita income, a 35x increase in nominal GDP terms in just 30 years. In dollar terms, we have gone up by 7 times, from $348 to $2,500. So we can do it. Because the average growth, if we achieve, even steadily speaking, 6.5% in the next 10 to 20 years, that would transform. And if external sector also pitches in with contributions in some years, and that I'm going to leave it to my colleague Sunil Bartwal, then I think we can add to the 6.5% trend growth in those years when exports also can kick in, but that is going to be a much bigger challenge than before. So my apologies for taking a few minutes more than what I was allotted. Thank you very much. I borrowed from Janmay, by the way.
Did borrow from Janmay. Now, can I request the Commerce Secretary, Sunil Bartwal, to give his address, please?
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think, Mr. Dinesh, you moved to the extreme right to corner the government.
To see the screen.
But I'm very glad that you have come back to the position where government is also at the center. Okay. I mean, the job of the last speaker is that one has to also take care what has been spoken before. So Janmay was correct that, suggestions have to be given publicly rather than privately, because that is how the corporate profits in India are growing. And he has to take care of his firm too. But yes, very wonderful suggestions, and I will come to those suggestions shortly. Ananta mentioned about the various macro parameters which are very, very important from the perspective of Indian economy. And I will also like to focus on some of them. But since I am Commerce Secretary, and unless and until I focus on what is the role of trade in growth, I think I will not be doing my job fully. So Ananta spoke about how important the trade growth is for the GDP growth of the country. And many times, trade is not understood in the terms of the GDP growth. And let me tell you, which perhaps Dinesh also mentioned, that if you look at the global economies, you will find that Indian economy is one of the most open economies of the world. And this is not rhetoric which I am saying, it is coming out of the facts. If you look at the current position, 45.8% of the GDP is from trade alone. And I do not wish to refer to the Draghi report, where EU is saying that they are much more open than US and even China. I was also looking at the figures. Compared to 45.8% India's trade contribution in GDP, In US, it is hardly 38%, and in China, it is 25%. So I think one very important change which has happened over the period of time, and in fact, if you look at 1991, 92, it was hardly 17.1%. That now we are a much more open economy. And I think yesterday when Finance Minister was here, she also mentioned that now we are part of the global value chains. And India is much more part of the global value chains than any other country. It appears perhaps that China is more open or US is more open, but India is very open in that terms. So I think you should understand one very important fact, that without the growth of trade, GDP cannot grow. And therefore, trade is a very, very crucial element for GDP to grow. We have been doing wonderfully well in terms of our exports. Our exports reached about $778 billion last year. We are growing at a good pace. Of course, Ananta mentioned about the issues related to supply chain disruptions due to conflicts, due to Suez Canal getting blocked. But another important issue which I would like to bring to your notice is that if you look at the trade data, you will find that it is the services sector which is giving the maximum growth to India. And therefore, I would like to focus on that services sector focus has to come, not only in terms of what we produce within India, but also what we export from India. And I think I need not say that the IT and ITES services have done so much for India. And in fact, when I was talking to EU with respect to our EU FTA negotiations, they were telling us that, well, EU may be more competitive in terms of manufacturing, but India is much more competitive in terms of services exports. And they want to have this balance in the FTAs with respect to services. And I said, yes, we will do so, because we feel that services sector has a huge potential to grow. And if you look at another figure, which is again very, very important figure, which you should remember, that the total exports, India's services share in total exports is 43.8% currently. And if you look at the global average, it is hardly 24.7%. So in fact, our services sector, and I will come back to the question which Janmajay raised about how education should be looked at in India. And I will come to that issue shortly. But let me tell you that even in advanced economies, France, it is hardly 35.6%, USA 33%, EU 29.2%, Japan 22.1%. And we are here at 43.8% services share in exports. And when I look at the growth rate in services sector, which is growing at more than 7%, you will find that soon we are visualizing that our services exports will even take over merchandise exports. Or at least it will reach 50% of the total trade. Now, what we should do if we have to really grow, and what should be the focus? So I fully agree with Janmajay that there has to be a focus on education. Because if the services sector has to grow, which is a very strong backbone for us, then I think the STEM professionals, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, I think these are the subjects which needs to be focused upon. I also feel that this is also our strength, our STEM professionals. And I was looking at some of the figures, and I got this figure that 2.55 million STEM professionals graduate every year in India. And this is our strength. And we are the second largest in terms of STEM professionals. So perhaps if our GDP has to grow, our exports have to grow, I think this is one area where we need to focus upon, and rightly so. So I think education, right from the primary education to secondary education and to higher education, the focus on digital literacy, mathematical literacy, and understanding the digital ecosystem and the tech ecosystem is very, very important. If you have to innovate, then I think perhaps unless and until you have that mind which can rationally work and scientifically work, you will not be able to reach that higher growth trajectory. Another thing which was mentioned, I think Janmajay said that five issues, but I will take up at least 2 issues which are directly relevant to trade and growth. If you look at digitally delivered services, and he talked about that, and Ananta also talked about it, now $4.25 trillion of services are digitally delivered, which means that trade, our share in trade, share of trade in GDP, the services share in GDP, and then digitally delivered services within the services sector. That is again going to be very, very important because the whole world is moving towards the digital world. And let me tell you, when we talk about, the kind of impediments which we face when we do merchandise trade, similar impediments are not faced when we do the services trade. So merchandise trade globally has been very, very weak, but the services trade globally has been very, very strong. Despite all the conflicts, despite all the impediments which have come. So my point is that India, if it has to have a growth story, needs to focus on the services value chain. Yesterday, in fact, Honorable Finance Minister also mentioned about India's role in the value chain. And I will say that if you look at the value chains, gone are the Ricardian days when wholly obtained products were exchanged between the countries. Now you have a different world where 70% of the trade is intra-firm trade. It is happening within 2 different branches of an MNC. And CII is also kind enough to invite me in the second session, so I think I will be focusing on that issue later on. So let that surprise remain. But the point is that not only services as such is increasing, but if you look at manufacturing, the servicification of manufacturing is also happening. There are companies where servicification of manufacturing is up to 50%. Globally, the average may be around 20 to 30%. But there are companies where service part is almost 50%. And that service part is right from the value chain, starting from the R&D, innovation, financing, venture capital financing. And that is why, if you look at India, a lot of companies are coming to India to set up their global capability centers. And these global capability centers are again benefiting out of the STEM professions which we have. So I think that education's role, the role of R&D, the role of working on the whole value chain of services sector is also again very, very important. And it is not important only from the services point of view, but if we want to improve our manufacturing capabilities. So I think I've been given only 10 minutes. I have a lot of things to say, but I think I will confine myself to these 10 minutes. So what I would say in conclusion is that if we have to grow, and let me tell you that government is focusing on Vision 2047. In fact, yesterday, when we met the EU commissioners, the head of the missions in India, and we were discussing about the Draghi report, which talks about innovation, and which also talks about the long-term planning for European Union. I also told them that how India is looking at 2047 as a path to vision for ourselves what we need to do so that we are able to become the third largest economy of the world, not only in terms of GDP, but also in terms of the higher share of trade and exports. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity, and I'm very glad that you have chosen a very, very contemporary topic which impacts all of us hugely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So I think we heard the three speakers covering, I would call it, maybe Janmay talking about the ones which we don't speak about normally. Ananta Nageshwaran covering the issues which we will need to tackle, so to say, as priority, at least for the short-term view of the growth of India, and obviously that will support the long-term growth. And we heard Sunil Bartwal covering, I would call it, the broader spectrum of how services trade and support which the global economy is going to give can be further supplemented. So let me start with, I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Before I throw it open to the floor, maybe can I ask what would be the 3 areas which we will need to avoid, as I would call it, to make sure that we can sustain the growth, or the 3 areas which we will need to focus on immediately to be able to sustain a higher rate of growth than what we have today from the industry perspective. I mean, we understand what we will need to do from the various changes of reforms, etc. And maybe I'll start with Ananta Nageshwaran and then ask the other 2 to come with their comments.
So in terms of what to avoid, I would leave that task to Janmay, because it is easy for an outsider to say, please don't do these things. So, and it is a good question, because we tend to focus on all the important things that we need to do, but also certain things, sometimes it is good not to do the wrong thing. That itself will be a great starting point. So your question is very apt, but I'll leave it to Janmay to answer. But I mean, what we need to do, I think, the skilling and the skill gap in these countries has to be identified. So while we say skilling broadly speaking, but specific steps is there are so many areas where what is the demand for specific skills, not just mechanical skills or cognitive skills. Today, for example, elder care, counseling, nursing, all these things are going to become important. So what are the skill requirements? What is the possibilities that exist in terms of university seats or college seats or polytechnics, ITIs, etc. And therefore, what is the gap that we need to bridge? How many institutions we would need? What is the kind of teacher requirement, etc. So that is, we have to drill down to these specifics in terms of addressing the skill gap, because without that, I think the industry will also say we can't hire, there are not enough qualified people, and that is one that we need to do. The second thing we need to focus is also on higher education, where I think we can allow market forces to play the regulatory role far better than we can do ourselves from the government perspective. And the third thing I would come back is this overarching importance of this energy transition and getting it right, because that is an international issue, transcends boundaries, and we need to make sure that we follow it in a manner calibrated to India's interests. And otherwise, that will be a huge drag on our trend growth rate. If we follow the fashion of the day rather than what is necessary and relevant for India, whether it is with respect to non-fossil fuels of energy or e-vehicles, etc. We need to make sure that we follow them at a pace and in a manner that is relevant and suitable for our growth needs. This would be on my top of my mind.
Thank you. I thought maybe the last one is a thing to avoid for us also, right? Not follow what they...
Yeah, I think you're right. You can phrase it that way as well.
Yes. So, Sunil Batra?
Right. So, as a Commerce Secretary, I would say that one thing which globe should avoid is protectionism and trade barriers, because I think whether it is merchandise trade or it is services trade, unless and until there is more collaborative approach in terms of removing the trade barriers, in terms of having more of MRAs where the services recognition, the qualification recognition happens, our nurses can go, our other professionals can go. And let me tell you that there is a huge possibility of providing professional services. And therefore, the MRAs are very, very important. So I think what the globe needs to avoid is, the kind of protectionism which creates more trade barriers, which creates more technical barriers to trade, which hinders trade. I think that needs to be avoided. And I would also say that one more approach needs to be avoided, and that is the mercantilist approach, that when you are too much bothered about your trade balance, and you are too much bothered about your imports, because if Indian economy is growing at 7% rate of growth, which will be the long-term rate of growth, and if the world is growing at 3 to 3.5% rate of growth, then obviously India will be requiring more of consumption. India will be requiring more of imports. And let me tell you that the role of imports in exports is also very, very important. There are intermediate products, there are raw material which are essential. So I think what we need to do is to avoid any mercantilist kind of an approach. And we should look at realistically, as long as we are able to improve our export share, we should not be too much concerned about the imports. So that is what I feel that we need to avoid. What we need to encourage, I've already said that we have huge potential in terms of our services exports. In terms of improving the service part of the merchandise exports, the servicification part, which we can raise, that which we are doing, by bringing in GCCs and others, so that, the pre-production and the post-production. Pre-production may be R&D, innovation, startups. Post-production is marketing, branding, value addition, in terms of retail trading, etc. So I think that needs to be encouraged, and I think that gives an edge to India, and I think that edge should be fully utilized. Thank you.
Thank you. Janmay?
So, a couple of years ago, I had written a small piece saying that developing countries are project finance economies and rich countries are working capital economies. What do I mean by that? If you're a rich country, your per capita is high. Tax revenues from that per capita can fund your normal expenditures, and most of your infrastructure, basic infrastructure and all, has already been built. So you are in an equilibrium. Unless you do stupid things, you can stay within that. Then if you, of course, have a war or some other problems, you then borrow, but then you have to, and some of you don't need to repay, but others have to repay. A project finance economy, the per capita is very low. So if you want to become richer, you need to borrow and invest it well so that you can get a return. So the last 4 years, the finance ministry has done a terrific job with infrastructure spending. That's called borrowing and investing it into things that will increase the productivity of the economy. So what should the finance ministry not do? I would not like them to get into populism, which will be a demand which will come. We are an adult. We were from 1947 a full adult franchise. No other country was like that. It was done by the British to screw us, because we had to face all the social pressures from a very poor country, having to pay, like every democracy has to appease the various groups. Now, that pressure has stayed, and it will accentuate when there is a demand from different groups to give them short-term fixes. How we might resist it, what they can do in the commas and the full stops that makes it hard to get it, and so that much of the money goes towards building the things that will improve the productivity of India would be one of the recommendations that I would make and what we need to avoid, because I would really get quite anxious. You know, even post-COVID, what we did was remarkable. One of the only countries which managed without allowing our fiscal deficit to go out of control. And, you know, we don't talk enough about non-tariff barriers. You see, the non-tariff barriers India faces are not the ones that you normally read about. Credit rating agencies are a non-tariff barrier. You know, the Department of Justice of the US is a non-tariff barrier. Think about it. The US right now, one president pardons his son, the other president is a convicted felon. And the Department of Justice feels it is right in its purview to say we suspect somebody in India to have paid bribe to somebody else. We can't prove it yet. I mean, and then you can't access the global financial market because the US dollar is a superpower, right? So we need to be thoughtful about some of these and attack these non-tariff barriers, which are other than the ones that we normally talk about, tariffs and others, because this is part of the overall global ecosystem. And now we have a seat at the table. Maybe not a big chair, but we are certainly on the table. And so we can't be ignored.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I'm now going to throw it open to the floor. So Siddhant, go ahead.
This question, I guess, is for all of them, and I think particularly for the respected Commerce Secretary. You talked about GCCs and needing to push up the STEM graduates, but there is also an opportunity because India has a long legacy of history, English, and all these other honors. So if we can try and get, take an example like law, if we can try and get, for example, some law programs or tie up with universities to accredit the LLM course under the ABA, that opens a whole new area of GCC. Similarly for accountancy, there's a whole new world in ESG writing reports, preparing all this. All this is work that can easily be done in GCCs or specialized areas here. So I think the Commerce Ministry can do two things to help do this. One is to look for educational parity and make it a part of our platform while negotiating. And the second, perhaps, is to try and ensure things like data localization norms in, say, the US don't nip this industry. Because if the US says all companies need to keep all their data in US-based servers, then that can completely cut off the entire GCC industry, because how do you localize Indian product in the US, and perhaps there's a conflict in Indian data privacy laws also from that. So that's just a thought for consideration.
So I think you have raised a very, very important issue, and it is very, very important, from the perspective of the general theme which I was talking about, that how to make services grow. And if the GCCs have to grow, if the services have to be exported, then it is very, very important that, there is a mutual recognition agreement, and mutual recognition of the qualifications, mutual recognition of the education system, the mutual recognition of professional degrees. And in fact, let me tell you that in Department of Commerce, when we are negotiating FTAs with various countries, this is of paramount interest to us, that whether you are going for the MRAs or not, whether you are giving us reciprocity or not, that is the first principle which we are using. Because normally what we find that, when tariff barriers are reduced, it is very easy for the flow of merchandise to come. But unless and until these mutual recognition agreements happen, and there is a mobility which is assured for our professionals, there is a recognition of their qualifications by the importing country. Unless and until that happens, the services sector will not grow. So we are taking care of that in our FTAs, and that is why these FTA negotiations are very time-taking. Sometimes, it is said in India that why the negotiations are taking time. If you look at the EU-Mercosur agreement, which was signed only recently, it took about 25 years. I'm not saying that we should take 25 years, But the point is that these issues have to be dealt in a very, very subtle manner, conscious manner, because these are long-term agreements. And our long-term competitiveness has to be ensured, not only in terms of manufacturing, but also in terms of services. Thank you.
I would have loved to have asked more questions. I know everybody from the audience have been having their hands up, but okay, I think Karthik, I have to give you the honor of asking the final question then.
Is this on? Yeah, it's not even a question, just a suggestion building on the previous one. I think another major opportunity is given the aging in the West and the need for caregiving, I think working on kind of short-term work visas so that there isn't this expectation of kind of, settling in citizenship. But, and that has massive downstream positive implications of upskilling our kind of healthcare workforce. And then you go, you earn the foreign exchange, you get credentialed, learn the practices, and then come back. So rather than brain drain, you get brain circulation, and that should be a very, very high priority given the aging in the West and our demographic profile. So is that something, because there's a commerce element to it, there's a training element to it, it touches what Anant also touched on. So I would strongly recommend that this be pursued on a priority basis.
Asking a question or replying?
It's a suggestion, but asking,
Okay.
if it's being acted on.
Okay, so if I take it as a question, then you see, let me tell you that in, again, our FTA negotiations, this is a very, very important aspect. Normally people confuse between mobility and migration. When they look at it from the point of view of migration. What we are saying that we are not looking at migration. If Indians go there, if Indian companies go there, if they want to hire people from India because that is how you become competitive, then that mobility of workers, mobility of professionals needs to be ensured. And that is our argument, that we are not asking for migration, we are asking for mobility. And in FTAs, this is the point of negotiations with most of the developed world. You are very correct. In fact, the EU Draghi report, which I have been talking about, also talks about that even in European Union, what to talk about other countries, European Union by 2040, there will be a declining population. So they understand it. In fact, when we were doing it with Australia, we told them that you require about 60,000 plumbers in the short run. But normally, this mobility concept is confused with migration. So I think what we need to do in our narrative, we need to build that mobility is essential for growth of services sector, for growth of professional services, and in fact, it is also good for the developed world that they understand this concept of mobility and do not confuse it with the concept of migration. Thank you.
Yeah, and just if I can add to that, I think CII's agenda has been very similar to it. Every delegation of CII actually mentions the difference between migration and mobility. And I think we have worked closely with you, sir, to make that happen. So unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end. So I think the time's up. So thank you once again, everybody. And please give the entire panel a big hand, please.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh. May I now request Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran to kindly hand over a token of appreciation to Shri Sunil Bartwal for gracing today's session. And may I request all the speakers to come forward for a photo opportunity, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start with the next session right away as soon as we've turned the table around. Please remain seated. Tea and coffee is served in the hall itself. So request you all to stay within the hall. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, may we request you to come back to your seats? We are almost ready for the next session. May we request everybody to come back to your seats and just be ready for the next session, please? Our esteemed panel will be on stage very soon. Once all of you are seated. And we are welcoming our esteemed panel. Very welcome and namaste, Mr. Rohit Java, Professor Rick Roy, Professor Rishikesh T. Krishnan, Mrs. Helen Brand. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could be seated on your, come back to your seat, be seated for this very insightful and interesting discussion that's about to happen. Our chair and moderator for this discussion on building business leadership for a transforming world is Mr. Rohit Java. He is the Managing Director and CEO, Hindustan Unilever Limited, and President, Unilever South Asia. I'm not sure. Yeah, thank you. So we're just taking a moment to talk to our panelists about the clicker, and we are ready to start. May I request everybody to be a part of this discussion and come back on your seats, please. Thank you. With that, Mr. Rohit Java, may I invite you to do the opening remarks and open the session, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Good morning. Welcome back. So very excited to be here. It's a very important event and just the right time of the year, and I have the privilege and honor of being with an extremely great panel. And the topic that we will be spending the next hour or so is building business leadership for a transforming world. And I thought that I'll start first by giving you a little bit of personal reflections before I introduce you to our panelists and also hear from their perspectives. I work for HUL, Hindustan Unilever, and our business is of course, focused in India, reaching 9 out of 10 households in the country, serving all segments of the market. And clearly where I come from is basically from that lens. So I just want to touch upon, to set the context, the big changes that all of us see, but just to frame that so that we can start to think in some sort of a structure and give you a little bit of personal reflection on how we in Hindustan Unilever are reacting or reflecting or adapting to these changes. And then I will move to the panel and we'll hear from each one of them and their perspectives and bring it all together into a discussion. And finally, some open questions and then a wrap up. So that's the plan. So I think all of you are familiar with the big forces. And I just want to touch upon them. And there are four that I want to speak to. The number one, of course, is the way the world works is transforming. We all know that, from era of globalization to post-globalization and multipolarity, and with all the changes that we see towards more inside thinking, more insular thinking, more localized thinking. It's a trend that we see across all parts of the world, whether it's the US, Europe, and even in our own neighborhood. We can also see conflict that is adding volatility. So the world, we used to call it VUCA in the past, and many other terms, but it's absolutely suffice to say that the level of change and unpredictability is increasing exponentially. And what might happen next year, in fact, is also open to question. And with the change in, of course, the leadership in the US and how it will bring the impact on tariffs and trade and other such global platforms is for us to see. So clearly that's going to create waves that impacts countries like India. The second force, without doubt, and it's a force that India's really been at the forefront of leveraging to its advantage, is digitization. And in the previous session, you heard from our speakers on the DPI, the digital public infrastructure. If data is the new oil, then India has immense amount of data, and so does the world. And all of us know what's happened over the last year or two with the revolution of AI. And certainly in my own mind, it's obvious to me that, and is so clear, and more one reads and learns about that AI or digitization is basically, we are on almost the next era of change, almost as iconic and as momentous as the industrial age, the internet age, and we're clearly in the onset of a completely different age. And that'll put pressure and force change on all of us as individuals and organizations. Climate change is spoken about, resource stress, and all of us see this in the environment around us. India, particularly impacted by climate change, and in business we see this with what's happened to our commodities, what happens to our communities, and what happens to weather and the impact it has both in terms of the social good as well as the damage it creates. And it's not something that one can actually ignore. So I think climate stress, resource-constrained world is a reality we're dealing with. And finally, demographics. At one end, you have much of the world that's aging, where the pressure on generations, on supporting more aging society with its health or pension funds is increasing. And importantly, on the other side, you have India and Africa. They are still very, very young countries, and the bigger question is about demographic dividend or demographic burden. And how exactly do we deal with that? How do we ensure that there's equity and there's also fairness and inclusivity in this new world? Now, with all of these four big changes, I think for me, when I look at what we or I should do in India today, or as a leader of this large company with a big impact in India, and our mission is what's good for India is good for HUL. And two words strike me. Number one is adaptivity or resilience. How can we not take world for granted, build scenarios and learn and create a more agile and adaptive organization that can react to increasing costs in one end of the business and decreasing costs in the other side of the business. And the second is compassion and inclusive leadership, because we have to carry 1.4 billion people. This growth and the prosperity we spoke to cannot just be the preserve of a few. So that is how I wanted to sort of set the stage for my guests. I want to first start with Helen. Helen Brand, OBE, is the Chief Executive of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, or ACCA, from the UK. She has led the association through a period of global growth, which has seen its membership double to more than 250,000. Helen was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in June 2011 for her services to the accountancy, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Exeter in December 2017. So Helen, thank you for being here. I know your passion for value-based organizations, and over to you for giving us your perspective about what should the leaders do in this world.
Thank you, thank you. So before I start, just to thank CIA and the Ministry of Finance for organising such an amazing forum where we can explore these ideas together. ACCA signed an MOU with CIA in May this year, and I think we hope that sharing insight, and probably one of the big lessons for leadership and collaboration, is actually going to provide solutions for the future. So we're delighted to be doing this. And to have this discussion in India, which is, you know, emerging definitely as the global talent hub, is so important. There's just one extra point. Is that a lot of what we're going to talk about, I think people tend to apply the thinking to existing leaders or people who are leading. But much of what we discuss, I think, needs to be integrated into the education and training of people at the very start of their careers if we're going to have the sustainable businesses and economies that we need in the future. So take it as given that what I'm talking about is actually for leaders at all levels, not simply those driving large corporations and organizations. I think we're all going to identify similar forces that are driving the change that's needed, and you've covered a number of them. In our scenario planning and when we're looking at strategies for the future, we identified 5 key areas, so just briefly touch on those. Economy, so you know, the continuing volatility that we're seeing, which is not going away, as we heard in the previous session. Geopolitics, I think, you know, at the moment we all wake up thinking, has another government fallen today? I mean, we've had France, South Korea, Syria just in the space of, you know, a couple of weeks, and that is continual, and we all have to navigate through that. Sustainability, the environment, sustainability in its broadest sense, people, planet, profit, you know, that's definitely a force that's coming at business from many angles, whether it's regulatory, whether it's from the consumer, whether it's from the investor. That's all having to be dealt with. The societal expectations of business have definitely shifted, and that's something that leaders have to consider. And then that ever-present technology change. I think, you know, to my personal knowledge, I've been discussing that for 30 years, but every year it seems to be accelerating in terms of what leaders need to understand and what they need to apply. And I think the important point of all of these forces is it requires integrated thinking. You know, they can't be addressed in silos, and I guess what we're trying to explore is what are the leadership attributes that are going to enable that to happen as we go forward. I think that for all organisations, be they commercial, non-commercial, public sector, being very clear of the purpose and values of that organisation is absolutely critical. Because when we talk about that world around us, it's how do we navigate it? And if you don't have that guiding star, if you don't have that clear purpose for the organisation and you're not leading your people in that way, in an authentic fashion, it is going to be extremely difficult to be resilient and to navigate. So for us at ACCA, we talk about our purpose being a force for public good and leading the global profession by providing opportunities. And I can tell you that, for example, through the COVID crisis, every decision we made came back to that purpose and the values of integrity, inclusion and innovation that we hold underneath that purpose. So sometimes well, this sounds abstract, but no, they absolutely can be applied to the decision making for any organisation, whichever environment it's in. On sustainability, it's really interesting being in India this week. I feel a real uptick in the urgency around business model change, around understanding how the long-term sustainability of business is going to be achieved. And some of that is being driven by the increasing regulatory and standards work that's coming into play that, of course, is requiring compliance. But as I always say, it's no good just coming out with a report that complies. This is about business change. So how are you going to understand the changes that need to be made in your organisation to drive those sustainable outcomes and, of course, comply with all the regulation that is coming everywhere in the world. Broadly, that means focusing on what value you are creating as a business, not simply what profit, and understanding that value very much can be driven, we believe, through different capabilities in the organisation, including what we call now, rather than the CFO, the Chief Value Officer, who's going to bring together all that information that's needed to drive better decision-making for the long term. And finally, and probably most importantly, and in our recent research that we conducted globally, we found that ethical leadership being driven throughout the organisation, ethical business cultures, was the most significant issue identified by those in business. Closely behind sustainability and AI, most important, how ethical leadership is going to be embedded.
Thanks a lot, Helen. I think you touched very nicely upon the role of business and what it means for as a multi-stakeholder model. And that brings me to Professor Rick Roy, who is a professor of leadership and organization at IMD Business School, Lausanne, Switzerland. And he's a senior business psychologist, so that's a very unique label. And we'll know more about that when we discuss that with you further. And he advises boards and CEOs in matters relating to board renewal, CEO succession, and leadership transitions. His primary research focus is leadership ambidexterity, perform and transform. And he has carried out advisory work for some of the top global companies as well as the World Bank. I know you have a few charts for us, and I'll please invite you to.
Yeah, in keeping with the IMD professor tradition, I'll stand up and I'll use slides, so bear with me, just as David Bach did yesterday when he was here. I want to build on a couple of themes here. Rohit mentioned the need for adaptive organizations, and we've never needed more adaptability to adjust to all of these profound changes and forces, and that were very well outlined here. So what I want to focus on is our view on future-ready organizations that are adaptable and ready to pivot, change, and transform based on the context they're operating in, and then the type of leaders that are leading these types of organizations. So David Bach, if you attended his session yesterday, our president of IMD was here, and my colleague, Dean Mishak Piskorsky, will be speaking this afternoon. And we have a few integrated themes here. The first is starting with the future-ready organization. So very briefly, Professor Howard Yu and Professor Mark Grieven run a Center for Future Readiness. And each year we build a Future Readiness Index of the top 60 companies across a number of sectors, and using a whole series of measures, as you can see here, to benchmark, if you will, or provide an index of future readiness. Right? So that's our starting point, and we spend a lot of time advising, teaching, and doing research around robust, resilient, adaptive organizations that we would call future-ready. Not future-proof, but future-ready. And if you double-click on the leading companies in each of the sectors, they have something in common. All of them are able to simultaneously perform and transform, as Rohit mentioned. They're able to reposition the core business, keep it relevant, keep it profitable, continue to extract value, and keep it competitive, while they're creating new growth engines, new business models, new product services at the same time. This is a big ask, and the companies that are future-ready in our research are simply better than their peers at doing that, running what we would call dual transformation organizations. So we've got the findings of future-ready organizations. Now, Professor Mishak and I set out to look at those organizations and say, can we come up with an evidence-based model to what good leadership performance looks like in a dual transformation company? And now we had 20 global companies join us in our first sprint to build a performance model. And now we have about 110 global companies have deployed the performance model that you see here, which is essentially a perform, transform model. There's a couple of important elements here. First of all, we call this ambidextrous leadership. It's not a new term. If you go back to Tushman at Harvard and O'Reilly at Stanford many years ago, as Rohit is well schooled on, they came up with the ambidextrous organization. So it's been around for quite some time. We thought it was the right model because leaders running these dual transformation companies are having to use opposing ways of thinking, behaving, and leading. So we call ambidextrous leaders that can both extract value from the core and keep it valuable and create new value through tomorrow's organization. So first of all, that requires a set of opposing ways of thinking, leading with emotional social intelligence with more range and more behavioral range. So cognitive range, emotional social intelligence range, and behavioral range is what we found. And we also found that there are 5 distinct capabilities and 10 performance behaviors across these companies that distinguish leaders that can do this. So we've done a fair bit of follow-up on the data since we built all of our own instrumentation, so we have access to the data to look at different trends and findings. This is a graph showing from right to left in terms of level of seniority, ambidexterity requirements going up with each position level up through CEO. So we do see that the demands for ambidexterity rise as you move up the organization. And finally, just a few early conclusions on this ambidextrous model that we've been running with about 110 or so companies. First of all, the future-ready companies are better than their peers at managing this dual transformation challenge of perform, transform. That's one of the hallmarks of the winning future-ready companies in our research. Future-ready companies are led by ambidextrous leaders. To get ambidexterity largely comes through diverse experience. And when we look at the leaders that have been through our diagnostic assessments and are part of our research database, we found that 6 to 9 roles, diverse roles, is kind of the sweet spot to develop ambidexterity as you progress to C-suite roles. More than 10 unique positions, there's no material or measurable difference in ambidexterity. So 6 to 9 diverse roles, and many of the CEOs and senior leaders we work with have made at least one dramatic pivot during their career out of their function, out of their geography, and so forth, to build what we would call leadership range. So leadership range is another way of describing this ambidexterity. This leadership range, cognitive range, or you could call lateral thinking, social intelligence, emotional range, and behavioral range distinguish the top leaders in our research. We've done 3 rounds of performance validation showing that range differentiates across their senior peers. And this is largely working with the top 200 leaders of these respective companies.
Thank you, Rick. This is really exciting. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about that in our next segment. But let me come to Rishi. He is the director of IIM Bangalore. He has been a management academic for more than 28 years at IIM Bangalore. His primary focus area is strategy and innovation. And he has authored 2 books on innovation and has figured in the Thinkers 50 list of most influential management thinkers in India. And I think no better subject than innovation as well that we'll probe on, because if you have to transform to the future core, innovation has to be in the lifeblood of that. But before that, some thoughts from you, Rishi.
Yeah, thank you, Rohit, and good morning, everyone. So I'd like to build on what my fellow panelists were just speaking about and wanted to share with you some ideas that we gleaned from the COVID experience in terms of what are some of the critical leadership capabilities that we need in today's very volatile and fast-changing world. I think the first one that I would underline is the importance of scenario planning, because one thing is pretty clear: we can't accurately predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but what we can do is be better prepared for alternate scenarios that may emerge. So given that, I think if you just go back in history, you'll realize that companies like Shell, which were practicing scenario planning on a very regular basis, were very good at managing the different energy crises. And that just gives us one example to suggest that that's an important skill that the leaders of today need to build. The second important skill I would emphasize based on our research is the ability to read what you might call weak signals. If you just go back to the 2019-2020 period when COVID was on the horizon, while many of us started responding to COVID only around March 2020, the early signals of what COVID could, or the wrath that COVID could create was already available much earlier. And those companies or those individuals which read those signals early were much better prepared. So in a way, this goes with the scenario planning that I was just speaking about. It helps you to be better prepared. Third, I think it's very obvious that your ability to do much more sophisticated risk management becomes important, because you can't predict the future with certainty. You might or might not be able to read the weak signals, but what happens is bound to hit you one way or the other. So you better be prepared to manage the risks that will arise. And as a result, I would imagine that good leaders need to develop good risk management capabilities. My earlier speakers have already spoken about the importance of new technology, so I won't dwell on that too much, except to say that in today's world, one thing is pretty clear. Given the fact that we can't tell the future, you need to be much more agile in experimentation. You just look at all the digital companies whose services we use so often. What they really do is a lot of experimentation. They're continuously trying to figure out, should I offer this new feature? Is there something I'm missing? Can I try it out on a group of customers and see whether this is what customers are looking for? And then they're also removing certain things that maybe are not so important anymore. And given the digital environment in which all of us work, this experimentation is not only possible, but it's also fairly cost-effective. In fact, I read a very interesting article the other day which says that the role of the leader has changed. It's no longer to use his or her intuition to substitute for the lack of data, but instead it's to be the orchestrator of experimentation in the company. What that really means is the leader has to make sure that enough experiments are being conducted so that the company is well prepared to make the right changes sufficiently in advance. Many of us talk about the United Nations SDGs, and one of the important SDGs I keep hearing about is the one on number 17 on collaboration. But collaboration starts right at the organization level, and I might even say at the leaders level. I think your ability to forge partnerships not only with other companies, but with non-profits, with the government. I mean, one very interesting thing is we are seeing a whole new range of unorthodox political and government leaders who come with a different set of ideas. Can you really forge collaborations with the government, with these new leaders who are now coming in with their new ideas so that you're better prepared to deal with all the new eventualities that may emerge? In a sharply polarized world, your ability to manage paradoxes is also very important. You might have your values, and I think Helen did underline that, but the fact is you're going to have to work with a lot of other people who may not share those values with you. So how are you going to manage those paradoxes? I think that's another skill that leaders will have to develop. And related to that is not only emotional intelligence, which will continue to be very important. I loved the point that Dr. Anant Nageswaran made this morning about the importance of mental wellness. Obviously, if you want to be mentally well, it also helps if you're emotionally well, but also spiritually well. And I attended a very interesting conference a couple of weeks ago where they were saying it's not only about emotional intelligence, it's about spiritual intelligence. And here we're not talking about religion, we are just talking about the ability to, in a sense, be at peace with the world, so that you can take on all these exciting challenges that are coming up all the time. So to me, these are some of the leadership capabilities that we need to develop to be successful today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. This is actually, spiritual intelligence actually is really an important thought, and perhaps at the end of all of it, we should try and tease that out a little bit, unpeel that. What does it really mean for leadership in this volatile world? But before we get there, I just wanted to use the next 10-15 minutes to just discuss amongst ourselves a few questions that are on my mind as a practicing leader and operator in this country, and knowing your own passion points, and I'm going to dip on those and probably start with you, Rishi, and then go the other way. I think all of us know that really in India, the only mission all companies, organizations have is to grow. And if one has to grow in a world that's changing so fast, whether it's run by technology or with the macro factors, is innovation, is to do something that's not been done before. In fact, much of the structural growth we've seen over the last decade in this country is because of breakthrough, I think, epic innovations like the DPI that we just spoke about. So when we're dealing with a day-to-day business, I think there's always this dilemma on, things are changing so fast, there's no point testing things. Just fix it by, break it first before you fix it. Lean innovation, try it out, hack it up, and sort of jugaad your way around it and iterate it until you get this product market fit. And when you have a winner, then you go ahead and don't put mega bucks on big ideas that might not turn to be successful. But on the other hand, the other school of thought is about structural innovation, big technology platforms, science. And how does one square the circle in your view? Because you've written a lot about jugaad and innovation. Is there a sweet spot between these two extremes, or there isn't?
No, absolutely. I think one thing is very clear. You need a lot of ingenuity. You need to have some of those insights. You need to be able to improvise. You don't always have the time to do the detailed innovation or the kind of deep research that you might always want to do. But you need to have a foundation of deep research as well, because remember, technology is changing rapidly. You want to be able to use AI. You want to be able to use all the new technological innovations that are happening around you. So I would imagine that both of these need to go together. So ingenuity is important to be able to come up with those new ideas. But then remember, in a country like India, ultimately, if you're going to make a viable business, scaling that is going to be important. I mean, most innovations in India are low margin, large volume kind of plays. That's how you really make money. So you've also got to be able to scale it. So a lot of the current thinking, even on startups, is it's not just about either exploration or about exploitation. There's a sort of intermediate phase, which you might like to call extrapolation, which is saying, okay, now out of these ideas I've tried, these are the ones which look like they have promise. Now, how do I scale them, or how do I prepare for scale in such a way that I can exploit these ideas in the exploitation phase? And at the same time, can I build in a little bit of flexibility, because I may need to adapt these ideas as I go along. So I think that's the challenge for most organizations. You're going to have to be, to quote what my previous speaker said about ambidexterity, you're going to have to be ambidextrous, and you're going to have to build that into the organization. I think that's really going to be one of the critical capabilities. So I would say Jugaad is important, but Jugaad is not the only game in town. Getting things robust, scalable is equally important. And just a final comment on that. Just remember, today's customer has experienced low price, scale, and quality at the same time. And you know, in India, this goes back to the time when we all bought those original Nokia handsets. You remember they were just a couple of thousand rupees, but extremely easy to use and very, very robust. Ever since then, I think the Indian customer says, look, I'm not going to take a half-baked thing. I want a good product, but I want it at a low price.
Yeah, so I think the value, which is really no compromise there. And you know, the other dilemma, and I'm sorry for foisting my own personal challenges on you. So I run this nearly 60,000 crore, $7 billion scale organization. And when I look at the future, 5-10 years down the line, I can see that the channel structure is changing, getting more organized, more digital. I can see the media is totally changed, not just in the cities, but in villages everywhere. 1 billion people you saw connected on the internet. The content is the same, although in vernacular or not. I can also see the aspirations changing. So if we stayed where we were and keep doing the same thing, we would definitely decay and stagnate. So the change is absolutely critical to get to the new place. And in fact, some things that are not as big as what I have today. But at the same time, there's a huge source of cash value serving my existing business model that I cannot ignore. And I find it very difficult sometimes to have the organization go one way or the other way. So run or change. And I know you've got the DNA of what makes ambidexterity come true. So a question to you, how do we all run and change at the same time?
Run and change at the same time, exactly. So, so as we now have experience in helping senior leaders, executives run and change at the same time, which we would call ambidextrous leadership or developing your leadership range, the number one factor is experience. It's working in diverse organizational contexts, diverse sets of challenges that are outside your comfort zone. And as I said, 6 to 9 of those unique, diverse positions under different managers. And sometimes your best manager is your toughest manager as you're working your way through this. But 6 to 9 diverse roles, so it comes largely through experience, which is why we see more and more deep generalists taking over CEO and CXO roles versus specialists. There's been a movement over the last 15 years to deep generalists versus specialists running global companies. I'll just give you a quick example, and I hope I don't offend any finance people here. But when we used to do CEO succession, I've been doing CEO succession advising for listed companies for about 24 years. I've done a number of these, and I've done some here in India as well, which was super interesting. But basically, in those days, the logical successor to the CEO from the C-suite was who? The CFO. And over 80% of the internal appointments came from CFO to CEO in those days, right? For lots of reasons. Now, today, it's 16%, according to Spencer Stewart's CEO transition study last year, of CFOs are transitioning to CEO. And our hypothesis is that perhaps they don't get enough range and experience outside of finance as they were coming up to run dual transformation organization. So now the internal appointments that are going from corporate officer to CEO are largely from commercial, presidents running large complex businesses and regions, chief operating officers who have broad complex remits. And our hypothesis is they have more range, they have more ambidexterity, and they're better at context shifting, which is another skill you have to develop as you develop ambidexterity. And they can find themselves reading the signals more quickly in a new context, new business environment, new market, making sense of it, and then pivoting between these two ways of leading, perform, transform spectrum.
I was just counting the number of countries I worked in. By the time I got back to India, it was about 6 to 9 as well. So maybe there's some truth in the notion of range, of being pushed in to do different things in different circumstances, having a few tough bosses to give you a new school of leadership. And one thing that I noticed as working for Unilever, because we called out in 15 odd years ago, you know the company with Paul, who brought us back to the notion of sustainability as purpose, which is true purpose of how Unity was born, but he brought it back and refounded the company back in 2009 and thereabouts, 15 years ago. I think we were, or he was the first, amongst the first leaders to see the need for a more values-based, purpose-led business model. From then we moved on to target setting, and we had a phase when everything was being targeted and measured. And we've now come to the third phase, I believe, in this whole area of sustainability, which is more around, okay, what are the few things you can do as a company that can be deep and can make a huge difference, can make true impact, because the days of having a target is not enough. You need to deliver on these targets, and they are measured and audited and regulated. So I wanted to probe you on, sometimes even in India we have the notion of what is called BRSR, and it's evolving. So when you have this polarity of commitment to a purpose-based, values-based model, the one you talked about, versus complying at the other end of a certain sort of measures, how do we make sure that the companies truly get it and are not just doing it because it's mechanical need?
Thank you. And Paul was a fantastic leader. ACCA produced its first report called Environmental Reporting in 1990. So we've kind of been on the journey with Unilever in all of this, and been many iterations. I think that's a real challenge, and it comes back to a concept that the financial leaders, who we're trying to change, by the way, to make sure they do become CEOs, materiality. So I think when we first looked at the integrated reporting framework, it wasn't supposed to be overwhelming for a business. It was supposed to be, can you identify what materially your business impacts, and therefore where the change is going to have the most difference, whether that's for your people, the communities you work in, the planet, where you're going to make the most difference. So for many organizations, actually, carbon emissions are not going to be the most important thing, but social impacts might be more material to them. So I think having that broad view and being able to identify what actually matters, and then reporting that deeply and substantially is really critical. But there's no doubt that there is going to be the need for the development of skills and new capabilities in organisations. If you look at the European Union with the CSRD that's coming through at the moment, that has very broad and deep requirements on businesses to be able to both report on what they are doing materially to change, and also there will be assurance required on that reporting. A lot of that capability doesn't exist, either within businesses or within the firms who might provide that assurance. And by the way, the assurance is practitioner agnostic. So it is not going to be simply the traditional accounting and auditing firms that are going to be doing that, or individuals. It's going to come much more broadly from whether it's engineers, strategists who are currently doing that work. The one thing that's great that's going into all the frameworks, be this in China, be it in India, be it in the European Union, that there are ethical requirements related to both the reporting and the assurance. And so I think that deeper professionalism and professionalisation of individuals in business in terms of both reporting and assuring is going to give the public much more confidence. And ultimately, this has to be about changed business models that do ensure that we have sustainable economic and social environments 5 years, 10 years down the line. We saw with IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, many decades to get to implementation. We do not have decades when it comes to sustainability. So we have to see agility and we have to see adoption quickly. But I think to your point, that will be understanding what is material in your business.
So I think we're in a decade of high volatility, and the communities that we serve as businesses, as leaders, have to be healthy. The communities are expecting businesses to play a big part, the government to play a big part. They're going to hold us institutions to account. So a very important point is that there's performance management needed to really make a difference to the commitments that companies have made. Unilever has chosen its focus areas of climate, nature, plastics and livelihoods, for instance. But at the heart of all of that is got to be leaders who truly believe in authenticity, in making a difference, being good for the communities. Because unless the values are fundamentally rooted to that level of, let's call it responsible capitalism or inclusive nature, it's not really going to be good enough to just measure things.
Yeah. And if I could just say one important point in all of this, we hear time and again through our research, is the ability to attract talent to businesses to achieve. That's a huge issue for all organisations at the moment. If you're not doing this properly, you'll be found out, and actually the talent attraction and retention will become more and more difficult. So I think there's always enlightened self-interest in all of this, isn't there? But I think that talent acquisition point is also critical in getting it right.
Brilliant. I think this gets me to you, the people that you spoke about, and I think we'll open this up for a few questions to my co-panelists, and I think there'll be someone here to help us from the audience for the questions. Perhaps if you could raise your hand over there, and then one could get the mic to you. I think we have about 5 or 10 minutes and then we'll try and wrap up and leave you with some big thoughts from each one of us.
Yes, my basic question is that we are
just introduce very briefly, not a very long one, but.
Yes, I'm Anish Sharma. My basic question is that we are finding that the term is changing, from entrepreneurship to intrapreneurship. We are finding that employees are basically, companies are looking for entrepreneurship, which can basically look for people who can adapt to the technology, who can take risks, who can collaborate, and who can adapt to the vertical integration with the changing, environment, fast, rather than the traditional mode of, getting through delegation, which is quite, slow mode, and which basically gets the results, much more, and not that swiftly. So how do you see that? How do you see that role of entrepreneurship, in the organizations?
I'm happy
I think Rishi and maybe Rick.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I think what we are seeing in organizations, and maybe I should have added your point to the list I gave you, that we need an entrepreneurial mindset even in the corporate context. So I think sometimes we mistakenly believe that entrepreneurship means startups. Entrepreneurship doesn't mean startups. Entrepreneurship means a particular way of looking at problems, a particular way of identifying opportunities, a way of translating those opportunities into business concepts and ideas. And that's as important, or sometimes even more important, in established organizations, even like Unilever, as it is in a small company. And I completely agree with you. For example, at IIM Bangalore now, we have a core course in the first year, which is entrepreneurial mindset. It's not about, are you going to get into a startup? It's about, can you think like an entrepreneur?
Just to build on this concept, so the way we teach, advise innovation, because innovation is a critical part both for performing in the core and for creating the new simultaneously, right? You're innovating in both parts of the organization. We call the house of innovation. And the companies that are doing it well are rather disciplined in the way they set it up, from innovation strategy to governance to resource allocation, and to having a process for vetting and evaluating micro experimentation at scale coming into the organization as a way to assess potential for earnings and scale. And they've got a process for all that. It's not a random bottom-up process. And I just want to also, my colleague here talked about Paul Pullman and Unilever culture. It is absolutely a purpose-led organization. You can feel it in all the regions and the individuals you meet, and it drives them intrinsically. So I think it's a great model of what we talked about earlier. I just wanted to add that point, and admiration for Paul Pullman.
Thank you. Right there, yeah, please. Maybe
Good morning. I'm Sanjay Kumar. Sir, I think I've been practicing leadership. One thing I'd like to add, the leader has to focus many things, but the combination of target, team, and the trust. One of the elements we have not touched upon is the trust building with the stakeholder is one of the key priority of the leader. That's things.
Thank you. Thank you. Over there, okay. And maybe have one more from this section to keep it universe in balance here.
I am Sanjay Agarwal. I teach strategy, planning, and implementation, and I teach ethics and corporate governance. I feel, and I want a validation or contradiction of what I feel, and then if it is correct, I want a solution to it. The thing is, I notice a distinct lack of literature, case studies in the Indian context on this topic, building business leadership for a transforming world, or even on ethical business leadership. I have had to scrounge before the NEP came into being and we had a host of literature coming up. So is this perception correct, that there are lack of business studies in the Indian context? I repeat, in the Indian context, set in the Indian business milieu, which can serve as a torchlight for Indian businesses. And if it is correct, what are we doing about it? Thank you.
I think Rishi, maybe you can start. And
No, I think the good news is at a broad level, as many of you know, the number of case studies written on Indian companies has increased significantly in the last decade. We have multiple case houses who are not only accepting but widely disseminating these case studies. Specifically in the area you mentioned, I would probably agree with you that there are not as many as there should be. There are a few, and I think maybe we all need to collaborate to enhance that. In another avatar which I am part of, I'm part of the case initiative in the All India Management Association. So if any of you are interested in sharing your experiences of becoming part of case studies there on the theme that Mr. Agarwal mentioned, please do let me know.
one more question before we wrap up. We'll get the mic to you. Question or comment? Briefly, either way.
I'm Dinesh Vats. So whenever we are talking about business leadership, so that is, business means either the product or the services. So I have never seen the business leadership related to investment in human or working with human. So we have seen the example of E&Y, where people are working for more than 10 hours, 12 hours, or labor also, they are working overtime. So one thing which I have found, that there is no awareness or no material to work with the last person or to work with the person who really needs that stuff.
Maybe if I can just comment, I think this is the importance of the S in ESG, isn't it? And I think there is an increasing focus on that. And ultimately, you're going to have that rounded combination in order to meet the requirements both of business sustainability and of compliance that's coming down the line. I think there is work being done. If I just give an example, we've been looking at how the finance function can drive living wage considerations within an organisation. So I don't think that would have been top of mind as a topic that we would be exploring, say, 10 years ago. But now we absolutely understand that in order to, live up to the expectations of the S in ESG, that's the kind of work that needs to be done.
Can I just add a point here? I know if you just look at long-lasting companies, you take, for example, the Tata Group. I think Jamsetji Tata was one of the pioneers of a shorter working day and working week. Surely that has in some way contributed to the longevity of the Tatas. Take Unilever as an example. The founders, or at least two of the founders of Unilever, when you go back about 100 years, they were again very instrumental in creating good working conditions for workers in the United Kingdom at a time when factory working conditions were terrible. So I think if you look at the companies that have really succeeded over a long period of time, the answer is right there. I mean, those guys have certainly cared about people, and they have woven that into the fabric of the organizations they created.
Just two quick responses to the first about, if I understand the question behind the question, is about pressure, workload, resilience for all employees. Because let's face it, every year the stress level and demand level, role demand level goes up, right? It doesn't generally go down for most of us. And our view on that is about creating bandwidth and unlocking some energy and capability from your team, your organization. So many of these future-ready organizations have shifted from a hub and spoke to distributed leadership model, where they are giving more decision rights, authority, capabilities to the teams and organizations below them, which then in turn has this lift effect as you work your way down, and they have more range, they have more impact, they have more empowerment, and they're also growing. So there's a there's a virtuous circle here of distributed leadership in the organization.
You know, I think distributed leadership is almost inevitable when you connect it to the other point that Rohit made right up front, which is about geopolitics. You know, we went to this globalized kind of business model, but now if you're going to work within the constraints of geopolitics, you're going to need distributed leadership to manage your businesses in different geographies.
In fact, I think one of the sources of motivation of people, I mean, when you feel most energized is when you think you have control over your agenda, when you're empowered, you have the authority, decision rights. When people feel controlled or driven or directed too hard is when you lose motivation. So people work really hard because they want to or they love something. It's a work of art, it's a matter of passion. Great things get done when you really put your soul and heart in it. So I think somewhere when you create a value system or a culture where people want to, are willing to put soul and heart of it, you don't control them by time clocks or any form of controls. It's self-perpetuating. That's the kind of organization, frankly, that one has to lead in today's day and age. There's no way sitting in my role, I know what 20,000 more people are doing every day. They have to be, it has to be intrinsic, is my belief. And that does take some decades of value building. This sort of brings us to the wrap-up session. I just wanted to maybe start from Helen and go this way, and I'll come to close. And if there's one thought you'd like this our audience here to be left with, what's that one idea or key takeout for leadership in this changing world?
I think if there's one thought, very simply put, is if we want future-ready organisations, you're going to have to lead future-ready people. And the investment you make in your people is going to be absolutely key for the future.
So invest in the capital, human capital.
All right. So briefly, we're in an age where deep generalists are now rising to the top of organizations. And so I'd encourage folks that are specialists, which you absolutely need, of course, in organizations' economy, but to expand your range and take some risks professionally along the way in terms of job experience.
Thank you. Range it is.
You know, while technology and AI may do a lot of things, I think finally the key contribution of the human being is going to be creativity, innovation, and bringing in the human element. So that's really what we should be focusing on, given the rapid advancement of technology in many domains.
Do you want to touch upon spiritual leadership since I asked that? I will end with it. Like, what do we do to be spiritually sound?
No, I mean, it's a challenging subject, but I think basically what it means is we need to be at peace with ourselves. We need to be at peace and in harmony with nature. And we need to, have a sort of broader sense of, how the individual human being is really small in the overall sense of the cosmos. And, therefore, we should also have some sense of what we can do and can't do.
So there's that serenity prayer, control what you can control and don't get too unhappy what you can't control. So I want to just end with this big thought rather than trying to sort of summarize everything that you've heard. But really it's all about what is inside us rather than what's outside us. Thank you very much for listening to us. It's been a pleasure having such an honorable community around me, and thank you very much for the attention. Thanks.
A big round of applause for that very provocative and engaging session. Thank you, speakers. Thank you so much, Mr. Rohit Java. May I request a memento for our moderator, Professor Rishikesh, if you could hand that over. Yes, the photo opportunity, please. Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, and everybody in the audience, our very esteemed audience, thank you for being such a good audience and encouraging our speakers and being so engaged in these discussions. Thank you very much again. So. Brief pause in case somebody wants some tea, coffee, water. while we wait for our next set of speakers.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to start with our next session. May I request all of you to please come and take your seats. Our speakers for the session are already here and will be joining us soon. bring them on. They're all seated now. Not sleeping, they're all seated now. Yeah. Our next session, ladies and gentlemen, is building new and sustainable urban centers in India. It definitely promises to be a very, very interesting session. And for this, we have with us an extremely eminent panel, and they will be joining us in another few seconds, and we will start with the session. For this session, we have with us Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Member Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Jagan Shah, CEO, Infravision Foundation, Mr. Rajat Kumar Saini, CEO and MD, National Industrial Corridor Development Corporation, His Excellency Mr. La De Virta Kimo, Ambassador of Finland to India, and, of course, moderating the session is Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee. They will be joining us soon, and we will start with the session right away. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists for this session. The session, Building New and Sustainable Urban Centers in India. The special address will be given by Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Member, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. And to begin the session, I'd like to request Mr. Chandrajit Banerjee, Director General, Confederation of Indian Industry, to give the opening remarks and take the session forward.
Welcome back and good afternoon to the audience, and welcome to our phenomenal group of panelists that you see here. And we started yesterday. We are just 1.5 days old in this conference and another half day to go. We all know about how it started off with our finance minister opening the session. And from then on, in the many sessions that have followed, we have had many discussions which have touched upon, in many ways, the subject of this particular panel. Sustainability came into issues, urbanization and urban centers came in. So I think the topic that we have today of building urban and sustainable building new and sustainable urban centers in India becomes quite relevant, important, and relates to this conference, which is in its second edition. It's a great pleasure to welcome and have with us Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, the member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Honorable Prime Minister of India. And all of us many of us, I would say, that have been seeing him, reading much of his articles, seeing him speak on this particular subject and much beyond. And it will be great to have his thoughts and opening keynote by him for this session. Also with us is the Ambassador of Finland to India, Excellency Kimola de Berta. Excellency, thank you very much for being here with us. And it's a great example for us to know from him as to how Finland, which is a country which has done so well in this area of urbanization, smart urbanization, sustainable urbanization. I have also with me the CEO and Managing Director of the National Industrial Corridor Development Corporation. Now, everyone knows that how they are involved in those industrial cities. India, in its budget, as you know, we announced 12 industrial smart cities along the Golden Quadrilateral. And I'm sure today Mr. Saini is a very busy man, if I may say, with lots of challenges and lots of things to do to make these centers, these industrial centers, livable, these industrial centers attractable. And of course, Mr. Jagan Shah, who runs this think tank on Infra Foundation, which is again a think tank on infrastructure, a person who is himself considered very knowledgeable and experienced in the area of infrastructure. And Mr. Shah was instrumental in Indian Smart City Mission in his earlier capacity as the director of the India's National Institute of Urban Affairs. So a strong star-studded panel, which I would start off with Mr. Sanyal, but the format would be after Mr. Sanyal's speech, his keynote address, we'll have opening remarks by our panelists and a few questions, and the interested audience who puts up their request for a question would get the opportunity to converse with our esteemed panelists, and we'll wrap it up with some key takeaways and hard stop at 1:15. With that, may I invite our chief guest for this session and our keynote speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, to set the ball rolling with his keynote speech, please. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to CII for inviting me to speak here today. I'm going to speak about a topic, as you will see, I have fairly strong views, Some, like Jagan, knows what they are, but I'll give you a flavor of it. Now, of course, India is rapidly urbanizing. Development is about urbanizing, so it is not too surprising. But the issue that comes about is that how on earth do we go about creating cities that are sustainable, livable, and economically viable? Whether they are completely new cities or what will be, for the most part, old cities that need to be upgraded. Either which way, I'm going to talk about a few key principles that I think need to be talked about, because I think whenever we talk about cities and governance, it goes into a discussion about what kind of political structure should be so-and-so amendment or not amendment and so on. Frankly, no matter what structure of governance you set up for administratively, unless we as a people are clear about what are the principles of design that you need to use to build these sustainable, new, viable cities, we will not be able to build them unless we are absolutely clear what they are. So I'm going to lay out a few very key principles. I have only a few minutes. I have 10 minutes left now, so I'm going to be very quick about this. There are more to it, but some very key ones. First of all, when we are talking about sustainable cities and talking about lowering the impact of these urban centers on the environment in particular, and particularly we have to think about it, first of all, in per capita terms. We have to think about it per capita terms because we are a 1.45 billion people country. So, you know, there will be some very large cities which on aggregate may have very high impact, but on per capita terms may be much lower. So we have to think about this in per capita terms. And when you do that, a very different image of what a sustainable city turns out. You see, the critical point about sustainable cities is density. There can be large dense cities, there can be small dense cities, but they need to be dense. Dense, I mean squeezing lots of people together in a small area. Unfortunately, the mental image of what is a great green city is the idea of spreading it out. Whenever we have a discussion about this, we tend to get into this conversation about, oh, we need to decongest, which is short form for going and occupying farmland, forest land, and other non-urban areas and capturing it into the urban space. This, in fact, is the source of much of our urbanism going wrong. When you spread out the city in the name of decongesting, that is actually unsustainable. And the result of it is that we have ended up with cities that are actually not dense enough. Even Mumbai, if you go to the top of a tall building, you will look around it, is actually largely empty. Large parts of Mumbai, for example, the entire eastern seaboard, which is the Port Trust land, there are large chunks of land internally with derelict factories and so on, which are actually empty. So, if you go to the top of a building, a tall building in Mumbai and look around you, it actually looks less dense like if you were doing it in Singapore. And yet on the ground, the city feels more dense, whereas in Singapore it feels more green. This is actually an urban design problem. This is not a decongestion problem. Hong Kong and Singapore are far more densely packed than Mumbai is, and of course Delhi is. So an important part is to build the infrastructure and design it for density. I'm making this point because in your heads you will have the idea of Chandigarh being somehow more green than Mumbai. Actually, it's the other way around. Chandigarh occupies a huge amount of land to essentially house a very small number of people, keeping out the poor out of it, keeping out economic activity out of it, and essentially occupying large amounts of land. It is not even economically viable. If the chaps in Gurgaon weren't paying their taxes, Chandigarh wouldn't survive. It's a subsidy scheme for bureaucrats. It's not a city. So what we need, if you're talking about new cities, is not to ever recreate Chandigarh again. It's a bad idea. What you need to do is to build denser cities which pay taxes, monetize land, and do not occupy more farmland and forest land, etc. Densify them, use the land efficiently. Why is this also important? Because it's actually cheaper to run these denser cities as well. You need fewer kilometers of metro lines, you need fewer kilometers of wires, you need fewer kilometers of pipes. When you're going vertical, the pipes are visible, you don't need to dig up the roads. And so this entire design concept that we have in our heads of what a green city needs to be turned on its head. So this is one very important point I wanted to make. Secondly, we need to begin to think about what is viable for our Indian way of life in terms of aesthetics, in the way our society is set up. So, today, unfortunately, the most part, we tend to think of, for example, a gated community. Much of the literature will try and discourage you. I'm sorry, gated communities is the way we live. If you go to Ahmedabad and go and look at the polls, they are a gated community. The courtyard-based system, the Nukkad, is a gated community. That is the way we live our life. The Europeans may not live this way, the Americans may not live this way, we live this way. Because it creates spaces where a village, an urban village comes up. This is the space in which kids can be brought up and they can, many of us have grown up in areas when we, go out in the evening, maybe have dinner at a friend's house, come back from another place, play in that enclosed, safe space. That is how our community life happens. This is where we celebrate our Diwali, our Holi and festivals. This gated community is a way we set up things. So, a lot of Western literature somehow goes haywire about the idea of gated communities. I think that's the way our systems are set up. No, we should have no problem with it. It is not the gatedness of our residential areas, but the problem that we have of gating off our commercial areas. The commercial areas should in fact be open. So if you go to Nariman Point, most of the traffic jams are caused there by people going from one building to another. If you're familiar with Nariman Point in Mumbai, you'll see that Maker 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., they're all built by the same builder, but they all have walls around themselves. And most of the people are actually going from one building to the next building. Same thing happens, by the way, in Bandra Kurla as well. Most of the traffic is going from one building to another building. But to go there, you have to come out to the main road, walk along, and then go to the next, even when you can see the building right there. Now you go to New York, they're all open. So our residential places, we are encouraged to open up, but our commercial spaces are all walled in. But commercial spaces is where actually you want this interaction. So we need to flip this the other way. We are wasting way too much real estate creating walls between our commercial spaces. Also walls within our, in the private realm, by creating this mid-20th century of having spaces which is within walls between the building and the road. All kinds of private spaces are stuck between these walls. Please get rid of them. Third, this is about aesthetics. Notice how when you go to any part of India and you go to a neighborhood or building that built before independence, it could be a colonial area, it could be a princely state or it could be something that's pre-colonial as well. But what will strike you is that every part of India has a certain architecture and aesthetics. And yet anything built after independence, we have got the same drab PWD box construction. Notice this? So, pre-independence, we have a diversity of interesting local architectures. Post-independence, we are united in the ugly architecture of RCC buildings. Why did we end up with this? because our building codes do not allow us actually to build anything prettier. If we attempted to build the Taj Mahal today, we would not be able to, because it would violate all our building codes. Unfortunately, in the name of standardization, we have incorporated into our entire thinking process a mid-20th century brutalist architecture that violates much of the way we live, violates our aesthetics. It makes no sense why today if you go, whether you go to Chennai and go to the so-called layouts, or you go to Delhi and look at the colonies, or you go to Kolkata and Salt Lake, we have the same box-like cement architecture, which is derived from an alien idea. By the way, much of these problems that I am all talking about derive from a gentleman who is considered a fascist in the rest of the world, but is esteemed as a great architect and urban designer in India, Le Corbusier. And where does these Corbusierian ideas and design ideas come from? It comes from the wrong mathematics. So before I end, I'll tell you what is the source of all this problem. It comes from the fact that we apply the wrong maths to our urban design. We apply Euclid and straight lines and curved lines which are Euclidean. It leads to a certain kind of Cartesian geometry which is not the way we live our lives. The mathematics of traditional Indian architecture, of traditional Indian urban design is actually comes from fractals. Fractal mathematics, please study it, and complexity theory. This is the mathematics of nature. This is the mathematics of your nervous system. This is the mathematics of your circulatory system. This is the mathematics of a tree. This is basically self-replicating the same design at various scales. Okay, let me describe it to you. What is the aesthetic? Why do we find, for example, the ghats of Varanasi to be beautiful? Because there is no symmetry in it. So why does it look beautiful to us? Why does you go to Palitana and look all the spires of those Jain temples? Why does it look beautiful? Because it is the replication of the same motif over and over again in different scales. So in Varanasi, for example, those steeples, they are replicated over and over again. The ghats, the steps are replicated over and over again. And that leads to a certain aesthetic. That is the source of Indian aesthetics. You look at a Hindu temple. It has the steeple, there are smaller steeples, even smaller steeples. In fact, you may have it, even in the same steeple, they will have certain sub-steeples. These are essentially the logic of fractal mathematics. And now, let us look at how this would get applied into the way we think of cities. These are cellular structures and different scales. It will lead you, interestingly, to replicate Varanasi. Varanasi's roads are basically main road, short, smaller lanes, ever smaller lanes, mohallas, nukkars, houses with courtyards, right? Now, notice that the problem with Varanasi is not that it is a bad design. Varanasi, in fact, is just as old as the Harappan cities. Now, most archaeologists now beginning to see that Varanasi is one of the oldest cities in the world. It's at least been around for 4,000, if not 5,000 years. So it was contemporary to the late period Harappa. And yet those straight lines of Harappa did not keep Harappa and those Harappan cities alive. And yet those squiggly lanes of Varanasi are still around, suggesting something must be superior about the design of Varanasi. Because it is based on fractal mathematics, which is the way we live. The real problem with Varanasi is not that its lanes are all crooked and going all over the place. The real problem is we are trying to drive cars on them. Remove the cars, improve the management and cleaning of those lanes. That design is actually superior. If you're trying to walk, Varanasi is far superior to Delhi. If you want public spaces like Ghats, it's far superior to Delhi, today's Delhi. So what you really need is to clean up the place. Do not confuse a management problem with a design problem. So let me end this conversation by saying we need to relook urban design from an Indian perspective. We need to look for density. We need to create spaces which are fit our aesthetics, fit our way of living. So this requires us to rethink our architecture and town planning from bottom up, recreating what we are learning from, unfortunately taught in almost all our architecture and town planning schools. I'm sorry, what is taught there is actually damaging the way our cities are built. We all experience it, but let me tell you, this is the source of it. We are simply building the wrong kind of cities. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
So what happened in the last 10 minutes was nothing much unusual. So when we were walking in, I was expecting him to stir the pot, and you have. And you have done that extremely well. And so I wonder whether the panelists, the three that follow, are changing their talking points or tweaking it to follow the rest of the session. But great concepts, great thoughts, great challenges. Thank you for really doing that, Mr. Sanel. Appreciate. And I do not want to sort of give bullet summaries of what he said, because that's, I'm sure, pretty much in our minds. But I'd like to move on to the Ambassador of Finland, Excellency. Again, not sure if you are going to change the written document that you have in your hand in any way as you speak along. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and really it was, I think, very good opening for this discussion, certainly thought-provoking, and like you said, stirring the pot. But my approach is a little bit different. I just want to bring, let's say, some perspectives from Finland to this discussion. And really, I think to start with, urbanization is reshaping the way we live and work, but it also brings immense challenges. It is necessary, but we need to handle the questions related to energy, water, environment, infrastructure, and so on better than we have been doing so far. And perhaps I could highlight some areas where I believe Finland and India can enhance our cooperation to make urban centers more sustainable, more resilient, and more resource efficient. And I would say that perhaps the first thing is in my mind, a systems approach to sustainability. Urban planning in this century demands a systems approach that integrates energy, water, waste, mobility, and so forth. Treating these elements in isolation is no longer viable. Finland's experience demonstrates that bringing these together creates cities that are not only efficient, but are also more livable and sustainable. I think India's rapid urbanization is a unique opportunity to implement such integrated models, both from planning new urban centers to retrofitting existing ones. I think this holistic approach can reduce resource consumption, lower carbon emissions, and ensure long-term resilience. Second, I think water management is a foundational pillar in many ways, because water, of course, is essential for life and economic activity. Yet India is facing one of its worst water crises, with millions of people experiencing severe water stress. So these challenges must be addressed. And I think some of the key priorities from our point of view is, first of all, an energy-efficient wastewater treatment. Because nowadays, wastewater treatment facilities can be transformed from energy consumers to energy producers, for example. Also, wastewater recycling is something that addresses both water shortages, reduces pollution, and saves energy. Finnish companies do have significant know-how also in this area. I think a third area then is sustainable construction and infrastructure, where low carbon construction is going to be very important. For example, we have companies like Betolar, for example, who is pioneering technologies to replace traditional cement, because the raw materials for cement are running out. Also, the use of construction and demolition waste to create sustainable building materials is important, like is also developing concrete building, or let's say factories to produce concrete building elements, which really can improve efficiency, lower costs, and decrease carbon emissions significantly. Also, there are interesting models for example, factory as a service concept, where green factories are leased and later repurposed for other things. Fourth, I would mention energy and waste integration, because urban centers are not only major consumers of energy and waste producers, but these or integrating these solutions is really vital for sustainability. We need smart energy solutions, yeah, obviously. We also need biomass and biofuels, and waste management, treating both solid waste and also, let's say, waste in rivers and seas. Plastic waste is a key problem here that needs to be solved, for example. Then, fifth area that I would like to take up here is connectivity and mobility. Finland is often referred to as land of innovation, and we have consistently been at the forefront of groundbreaking technologies. Our journey, for example, in telecommunications is a prime example. I do believe that AI-powered 5G networks and in future 6G networks are enabling cities to become more efficient and sustainable. So from intelligent traffic management to energy optimization, smart metering and sensoring and so on, are technologies for creating urban environments that respond dynamically to the needs of their citizens. We have a company called Nokia, for example, which is a global frontrunner in developing both advanced radio networks and optical networks, which really form the backbone of modern data transfer. And 5G nowadays already is not just another step in connectivity, but is really the foundation of a fully interconnected world, enabling real-time communication, data sharing, and new generation of applications across industries. And when combined with smart technologies for real-time metering of electricity and water, for example, and atmospheric conditions, as well as, for example, charting the condition of roads real-time, are some of the examples of technologies that offer astounding prospects, I would say. But obviously, as everything becomes connected, cybersecurity and other means to ensure the resilience of cities becomes crucial. In Finland, we have had a systematic approach to these questions for decades already, to resilience and so on, but they continue to be a challenge also for us. So I think sharing of best practices and know-how between like-minded societies is a key to tackling these challenges. But urban mobility is another dimension here, and I think this EV charging infrastructure, smart ports and vessel traffic management, and even floating infrastructure are some of the issues that will be important. But overall, to conclude with, I really do believe that India and Finland do share a commitment to sustainability, innovation and inclusive growth. We are already partners in digitalization, education, sustainability and innovation, or DESI as we call our approach. And our partnership holds, I think, tremendous potential also to address the challenges of urbanization. So by combining Finland's expertise and technology and innovation with India's skills, ambition and scale, we can co-create solutions that not only serve our two countries, but also can set global benchmarks for sustainable urban development. So I think it's key is to work together to ensure that the urban centers that we build today become the thriving, inclusive and sustainable communities of tomorrow. And Finland and Finnish companies are certainly ready to partner with Indian counterparts on this transformative journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellency. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm sure there would be a lot of Finland's inputs which would be required as we go along in developing our smart cities and our smart and especially in the industrial corridors. And that brings me to Mr. Rajat Kumar Saini, the person who is at this point in time pretty challenged as he develops these industrial cities. And we heard our keynote speaker talking about clusters and how and he is supposed to bring these clusters which would be sustainable, and he would also have to build these clusters in a manner which is where he will also need to find talent, where he would need to bring in social infrastructure, and in areas which are going to be newly tread, unlike what Chandigarh was. So what have you got to say?
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. And unlike Excellency over here, I had to change my notes after the stirring and revolutionary speech, the ideas that were there. So I would just first like to briefly tell what we do. So we are named National Industrial Corridor Development Corporation. Many of you might have heard about Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor or Amritsar-Kolkata. There are many more. There are now 11 industrial corridors across India. And these corridors cover approximately 90% of the manufacturing that is happening in India. More than 80% of industrial parks in India are along these corridors, and most of the industrial land and where the industries are being set up is along these corridors. That can be taken as a positive thing or a negative thing, but that is the fact over here. We do a lot of planning for these corridors, as in what should be the infrastructure like, and by corridor, I mean not just those roads going from Delhi to Mumbai or Chennai to Bengaluru, but around 100-kilometer area on either side. So we do a lot of planning in terms of what should be the connectivity links, road, rail, power, ports, multimodal logistic hubs, etc., etc. And then the states and infrastructure ministries, they include all those things in their plans, and kind of a enabling ecosystem. So there is an existing ecosystem which is stronger than rest of the country, and then we strengthen it more. What we eventually end up doing ourselves, apart from making plans, is building these industrial smart cities that Mr. Banerjee was mentioning. There were 8 industrial smart cities earlier. Some of you might have heard about Dholera in Gujarat or Shendra Bitkin in Maharashtra, some part of Greater Noida in Uttar Pradesh. And going by or encouraged by the results that were achieved in last 10 years, government has approved very recently in the month of August, 12 more industrial smart cities. And when I'm saying industrial smart cities, these are basically greenfield industrial smart cities. So I sometimes say that it's the audacity of vision that is over here, in the sense that if I talk about Dholera, the master planning is around 500 square kilometer. So we have started with 30-40 square kilometer development as of now. That is where India's first semiconductor fab by Tata's is coming up. So the audacity of vision is there. And this is also some kind of lab for what smart cities can be like. When we are developing these smart cities, those are not riddled with the issues that are found in many of the legacy cities, many of the existing cities. So it is our job to ensure that all the ideas about planning, and I never use the word design, but the keynote speech that there are urban designing issues. Generally, the word that is used is planning, and obviously designing needs to be considered, as well as what industry wants. So all the sectors cannot come in all the places. So there is a kind of a study, a kind of nudge towards a particular sector to come up in particular areas, and that is dependent upon its location, that is dependent upon the skill set available, that is dependent upon the raw material, that is dependent upon the demand and anchor industry, etc., etc. So this is how we go about identifying the locations and planning about it. And then we construct these cities in a fairly conventional manner, as in construction of trunk infrastructure in terms of roads, power, water utilities, CTP, WTP, integrated command control center, etc., etc. And the industries are coming up. Now, coming to the issues that we face, which a legacy city might not face, is the social infrastructure. Most of the legacy cities, they have some kind of growth center, and social infrastructure over the years has developed. What we found when the trunk infrastructure was developed, when the industry was interested, the problem for the labor, the lower management, the senior management, or the middle management was the unavailability of social infrastructure. This was something that in our initial cities we had not taken into account, that there would be a problem related to social infrastructure. I think the prevalent idea was that you build a city, you build infra, industry would come, and just because of the layer of job, etc., etc., people would move in, and alongside social infrastructure will also come. But it didn't happen so easily, and not just it didn't happen, it is not happening so easily. And the industries sometime over there face problems. We have to find ingenious solutions about how to, so whether we should nudge industry to build housing and other social infrastructure, whether the government should pitch in for some of the social infrastructure. All these questions we need to grapple with. The ideas about sustainability of cities, or the kind of infra should be there, or whatever the kind of, ideally a city, what should it look like as far as the master planning is concerned, all those ideas are there. But these were some of the unanticipated issues that we are facing, and trying to solve it in our own way by getting stakeholders on board, by identifying the issues and all. And one more thing that we, or not just us, but which is being said, that cities as growth hubs, what Dr. Sanyal also mentioned, that if development is supposed to happen, it is supposed to happen through urban areas, and our cities need to be the growth centers, and not just growth centers in terms of economy, they have to create a significant number of jobs also. So if we are going to achieve that vision of $30 to $35 trillion of economy, and with manufacturing being 25% of it, then there needs to be that much manufacturing infrastructure, and it will lead to manufacturing, the jobs in manufacturing. So that is also something that we are trying to tackle with, that giving the infrastructure through which manufacturing can come. And not just the announcement related to 12 industrial smart cities, but many of you might have heard about the announcement about 100 new industrial parks or industrial areas by better use of town planning schemes. So the idea was that we need to make cities as growth hub as well as hubs for jobs in manufacturing. That is why these industrial parks near cities need to come, and land acquisition becomes an issue, so there needs to be a better use of town planning schemes. So all these ideas are being discussed, the schemes are being rolled out, the projects are being rolled out with specific targets, with specific aims, that this is the problem that we are trying to tackle. Industrial Corridor Program itself is trying to develop the whole ecosystem for manufacturing, and as well as the industrial smart cities. But there are problems that which we did not anticipate and are trying to solve, and those problems are especially related to social infrastructure once we have created the hard infrastructure. The positive thing that we have realized after the completion or in this process is there is no dearth of demand, as in there is no dearth of investments coming to these cities. So whatever we have created, it is being lapped up. There is investment, domestic investors as well as foreign investors who are interested in coming and investing in these cities. And if these problems, so this is, I think, one major force that is driving us forward, that all the issues can be solved, should be solved, but the main thing for the demand of this industrial infrastructure that is there. Because of this particular driving force, I think we would be able to solve all the problems that are coming on our way. So I would stop here and request Mr. Banerjee.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those issues which you have brought out very critically, and also I would see that these cities, these smart cities, these new townships being connected, as you talked about manufacturing. I would also imagine there are challenges and there are solutions of connecting them to the ports so that we are able to boost our exports, etc., logistics costs, all of that into account. And also, while you were speaking, and I was thinking of what Mr. Sanel had mentioned, was pondering on the point on, we are also going to attract a lot of expats living in some of these places and in the newer cities that comes in. And how does that come into, how do we get that, our traditional way of living, our traditional architecture, and also keeping these people also pretty much engaged with in these cities or attracted to these cities. Now I turn to the experts, so to say, Jagan, always, with all of this that have come up, many points, many areas. Digitization would take up a huge role in much of the solution. I also see the big data analytics, technology, all of that. And so for all those solutions, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. I think one of the most heartening things about this panel is the fact that 10 years after the Smart Cities mission was launched, we no longer necessarily have to inform anybody about what smart solutions look like or feel like. And as the ambassador himself mentioned, a country like Finland can actually see a market in India for the kinds of technologies and solutions that are on offer. If anybody, and I'm sure quite a few of the people in the audience were around 10 years ago, they might recall when CII planned in December 2013 the first Smart City Conclave, which I had the good fortune of actually being part of. We were exploring new territory. We were talking about what looked like, the future, and yet now the future has, in a sense, arrived, and we don't have to necessarily sell those technologies. So the market-forming impact of a policy like Smart Cities in India, that is clearly apparent now, and in a sense, we've been successful in that. It's an intangible success. I think with regard to the patterns of urbanization and the new initiatives like industrial corridors, I'd like to just reflect a little bit on that. I couldn't agree with Sanjeev more that the fractal logic of a city like Banaras is something that we need to understand better. Perhaps we also have to figure out how do you engineer such a city. But at the same time, we must also keep in mind that perhaps this is not an either-or situation. It's not choosing between one or the other, but India is vast enough to accommodate all kinds of solutions. And in particular, I want to mention the sort of the contrasting solutions, such as a kind of reticular kind of development that Sanjeev was describing, is something that comes about because of the accretion of history. Cities evolve over history, and a lot of that is a kind of accretive process. But when you're planning out perhaps for something like industrial corridors, new cities, maybe we should look back at the way that the West was occupied in the United States, in Northern America, where, for instance, Thomas Jefferson actually had a plan where what he called the democratic grid, which is the grid that you see in all American cities, that grid was laid over the entire territory of the United States, or what was not yet completely the United States of America. And that grid gave you a logic, it gave you a certain efficiency in the city layout, which today we should certainly study with great seriousness, because there is an efficiency in the grid which goes back not only to Mohenjo-daro, but to Roman cities, and lies at the base of a lot of our thinking about new cities. We should think about that, and I would recommend to Mr. Saini that definitely consider not a picturesque layout of streets and so on, but a very efficient grid as being, in a sense, your standard response to the layout. We are in a bit of a conundrum also from the economic perspective. The brownfield cities, which are messy, polluted, crowded, congested, are also the centers of the service economy that is playing a very significant role in the growth of our economy. And therefore, you're also finding that the indigenous growth in those cities is actually overtaking the migration. So interestingly, we have this kind of conundrum where you want to build on the captive capacity you have in your brownfield locations and attract migration to the greenfield locations. And you actually have to do both of these at the same time. Build on the capacity of existing cities, which are not necessarily manufacturing centers anymore. In almost most cases, none of the big cities are manufacturing centers, but they're centers of service economy, the financial economy, and financial industry, and so on. And you need to, at the same time, expand so that you accommodate new industries and new economic activities. So you need to take a geographical and a regional perspective on all of this. Cities at best are part of a much larger economic geography. And therefore, I think the corridor development is something that holds a lot of potential. But if we get it right, if we land up with the kinds of unplanned, haphazard, peri-urban growth around these industrial cities, such as something you even see outside Nimrana today, if you see, the informal city in Nimrana has created a huge pressure on the planned smart city of Nimrana. We have to plan for a much larger spatial expanse and make sure that what has happened to Delhi shouldn't happen there, where something like 360 plus urban villages in Delhi are completely beyond the scope of the so-called planned city of Delhi. I would almost say that Delhi is more unplanned than planned. And it's a result of not having anticipated the problems created by absorbing villages into your urban areas. And that's what we're seeing in peri-urban areas. And there is not only a kind of rent seeking that is happening from the planned city, but it imposes a huge burden, whether it is the burden of distance and commuting, but also environmental impacts of not having proper planned infrastructure. So we must keep all of this in mind as we think of industrial and economic and urban regions, rather than of cities alone, because cities are only building blocks, really, for larger economic regions. I would say that there are ideas already successfully applied in a country like ours. Joint stock companies like in Magarpatta in Maharashtra that created a very well-managed, efficient city, privately managed, privately created through a joint stock company of farmers. Now, I don't see why we are not exploring more such scenarios where farmers become part not only of land acquisition, but they contribute land, as they have done, for instance, in Amravati, in Andhra Pradesh. They contribute land, but become shareholders, so to speak, in the success of the city. This urban-rural tension, which has not fully been covered by policy, I think it's high time India fixes this. We look at the necessary policy interventions there. And my last point would be that all of this needs finance. And it is a pity that we don't, a country of our size and ambition, with the kind of urban network that we have, we still don't have dedicated urban financing, sort of sovereign funds, for instance. Why does NABFID only look at infrastructure development, but not look at urban as maybe a pillar within its financing strategy? Why don't we create a new sovereign fund for city development? Because that takes the load off already stressed municipalities, already stressed state government budgets as well. The Finance Commission can at best give us basic grants so that our water, sanitation, and basic functions can continue. But we need the infusion of capital, and I think you need to create the confidence that comes from a sovereign fund. Having skin in the game, if you want to attract the quantum of investment we will need for all of these cities and urban regions to become successful economic powerhouses, as have regions like Shenzhen become, and throughout the last 200 years, whether it's Europe or America or Africa, you will see that it's really economic regions that have captured the imagination of those economies and have delivered maximum results. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. When you have a very strong star-studded panel, we have always a challenge of time, but I think many of the questions that we had in mind have been pretty well addressed in many formats. We have 15 minutes left, as I mentioned. Some thoughts which have come from, which I would like to pose a couple of questions or 2-3 questions, and I'll not pose it to anyone in particular, but it would be nice if one of our esteemed panelists pick up any one of them, and I'll bring in 2 or 3 people from the audience with the time that we have, and then turn to our audience. One of the thoughts that which came from Mr. Sanyal's remarks and what the others said later was, all of this would require a change in mindset of those people, of the people who are on the ground, the people who are going to be in the city. I don't know whether you would like them to be called bureaucrats, but how do we get, I mean, I heard you speak about urban local bodies and the changes in structures can follow and the importance of it. But how do we do that? Because there is going to be much need for that. Second, I also, when I was listening to you, yes, we are the gated type, but if you really look at a city like a Gurgaon, it's difficult to even for the gated community now to walk outside the gate. And this requires, again, governance mindset of those to clean it up. Even the garbage would not get picked. We have to live in modern times, and the number of expats coming in and staying in these cities and the mix of culture, which is a phenomenal thing. But then I really liked your point on culture as on our own culture, and which has so much to work on. And my last point was on last mile. Today, as we move along with every strata of the society, a person who lands up in metro would come to work in another person's house in the absence of a last mile connectivity, would use an auto which is emitting whatever it is. So these were my thoughts. There are challenges on water, etc. But I'll start with you, Mrs. Sanyal, and then I'll bring in a couple of people from the audience and turn to the other panelists. Thank you.
So let me say that Indian town planning fails for exactly the same reason that economic planning used to fail. It is basically a top-down view of some wise men sitting somewhere who can draw some straight lines and curved lines on some board and think that that is actually what urban planning is. That's why I prefer to use the idea of urban design, because in there is a more evolved idea of what these social clusters will be and so on. So I'm trying to get people to get away from this idea that cities are machines for living, which is the Corbusierian idea, to think of it as an organic thing that evolves, things happen. And then what will happen is we'll stop having these conversations about, today the success of urban planner is, oh, you only planned 50 square kilometers, I did 500 square kilometers. This is a ridiculous way of thinking about it. Whole point about urbanism is concentration, right? That's why they are important. All great cities are concentrated. It's the economic and social power energies that get triggered by concentration that lead to cities. So why are we trying to spread these things out? So I'll give you one example. Whenever we want to build an IIT, the IITs have a debate of whether they should have 200 acres or 400 acres or 500 acres. This is a ridiculous way of thinking. Success of an IIT should be how little land it required, because that is what concentrates it. Go and look at MIT. It's built in the middle of a city, right? New York, or some of the best universities in the world are basically cities. Oxford is basically a city which has colleges scattered around it. This is a completely different way of thinking about the city. Whereas here, what we are trying to do is we have got this reductionist idea of an industrial thing that we have to plan top down. Whereas what I'm arguing for is a much more organic thing, which is made up maybe of these gated pieces, but in general is a much more evolving thing. Now, this is why my argument is the future is about managing Gurgaon better, not building more Chandigarhs. But in the end, I ask the best way to judge whether the truth of my statement is if two kids grew up, one in Chandigarh and one in Gurgaon, and they reached the age of 22 and just finished their undergrad degree, is the person likely to move, is the Gurgaon one likelier to move to Chandigarh or the Chandigarh to Gurgaon? Almost 90% of the case, the Chandigarh one will move to Gurgaon because that's where the jobs are, that's where their friends are, that's where the better bars are. Right. So therefore, why are we attempting to build these so-called industrial cities? So if you want to succeed with these industrial corridors, then it's not about trying to build ever more Chandigarhs in a larger scale. It's about trying to find bits and pieces where you can have these concentrated Gurgaons and manage them proper. So the point is never confuse a management problem for a design problem. The problem of Varanasi is a management problem. It's not a design problem. After all, we all go to Europe and wander around the cobble streets of medieval cities. They're perfectly nice to live in. London is a medieval city with all kinds of lanes going everywhere. No problem. It's actually quite interesting. So there is no actual problem with the messiness of that. Those grids are not the point. Manhattan succeeds with that grid basically because at a meta level it's extremely messy because it allows office blocks to be right next to residential blocks, right next to something. And there are all kinds of sizes of buildings. It allows for a certain level of messiness. If you don't allow for a certain level of messiness, what do you end up with? You end up with Dwarka area of Delhi. It's a Soviet-looking thing. It's brand new, by the way, but it's utterly unlivable Soviet construction, which is both aesthetically ugly and essentially maybe a grid, but essentially dysfunctional. So the point I'm making is that we need to figure out ways of creating more organic cities. You can plan for them, by the way. Singapore is a great example of planning for an organic outcome. And I myself was involved in a lot of that thinking, so I'm quite aware of how much thought went into it. But when you go into the middle of Singapore, for example, in and around that, where they have the Bay Area, look at how messy they have made it deliberately. They've got these the Sands hotel complex with a casino. Across from it is Esplanade. There is the CBD area, that's the Central Business District. In the middle of all of that, they have deliberately added in residential stuff and made it messy, deliberately. It's planned to be messy. And yet it's beautiful because you build the infrastructure for it. Instead, what we get in India is some attempt at creating a Cartesian grid. Singapore's modern, probably the most super modern place in the world, it not fit into your Cartesian grid. So it is not about the Cartesian grid. It is about creating a vibrant urban space. Sometimes a Cartesian grid may work, sometimes it doesn't. But in fact, what you really need to care about is about the fluidity of the landscape as it exists. One of the major problems with these Cartesian grids is that we don't take into account the water drainage systems, which are not Cartesian, but in fact fractal. So therefore, you will end up, there's no need to worry about the straightness of the road as much as whether or not it leads to concentration and interesting spaces, which are sometimes idiosyncratic. So I hope some, 12-minute lecture is not good enough to explain what I'm trying to say. I would like to have some photographs to express what I'm trying to say, but I hope I'm quite clear.
Very much. I think when Jagan helps us plan the next session on urban city, the urbanization from 2013, our focus would perhaps will dedicate the entire session on this particular aspect, and especially about how we can really look at what Sanjeev Sannyal just mentioned and deliberate further on it. It requires a lot more deliberation and come out with solutions. But thanks for opening up that box for discussions as we go along. I'll open it up to a few people for questions, some questions which I posed, which the others could ask as we go along. Nikhil, who has been involved, and water is a big issue. I like Nikhil, if you can pose a very short question. We'll have to have a hard stop. So Nikhil, would you start off with your question, please?
Thank you, CB. Firstly, right here. Wonderful session, and I truly applaud Mr. Sanyal's view on distinguishing between management and design. But the issue when it comes to water, and I think it was something that Jagan brought up as well, is that we are not planning adequately with the money that we spend and planning for the future. You brought up stormwater drainage in a sense in terms of one of the issues with water. I feel that there isn't enough appreciation for what is required for future planning. The timelines that we are using for planning is not adequate. I would appreciate your views as to how you view the timelines and funding in urban design while keeping in view your points about distinguishing between management and design.
Thanks. Ashima Goel, just a quick one, please.
Thank you. So excellent session. I would like to add some disruption to the disruption. Is it true that concentration is the future of our cities? Because with digital technology and the internet, a lot of people want to work from home, they want to work from green surroundings, so they migrate out and they connect into cities. That is one. And the second is, do these smart cities drop from the sky? Because we have so many census towns in India. Now, if you travel in Kerala, the entire area looks like a city. It's entirely built up. Census towns which are not designated as towns because they would lose the money that comes for agricultural development. And they don't want to spend money on providing municipal services. So shouldn't those also, can those grow organically into the concentrations of tomorrow? Yeah.
Siddhant, you wanted to ask?
Sure. I think it's very nice to hear this. There was recently an example, Athens is reusing its old Roman-era viaducts to pipe in water. So instead of planning all these new cities, every district has a headquarter. There are small urban centers already existing. Can we find ways to incorporate them? There is already some basic social infrastructure. So there may be a solution in reusing and organically allowing these old existing centers to grow.
Last, Ashank, a short 30 seconds question.
Okay. Thanks. It was an eye-opener, Mr. Sanyal. My quick point is, you well explained the space size can be inefficient. But too dense also has its own problems and inefficiencies. We need not discuss it all here. We all know Mumbai is housing in 400 square kilometers, 13 million people. So I think there is an optimum there somewhere. Not too dense, not too space. And somebody has to find out what is that density. And I don't think there is a clarity in the planners of cities. Today we spend a lot of time in increasing FSIs, as we call it in Mumbai, floor sense index. So I think at a national level, we need a study as to what is an optimum density. That's all I'm saying.
Thanks, Mr. Sannyal.
So first of all, there's no such thing as an optimal density. It depends what you're trying to build. So obviously, a financial hub will have much higher optimal density, or if there is such a thing as an optimal at all. and it will vary in different parts of the city. So first of all, I don't think we should work towards defining an optimal density, because immediately it will be put into our building codes and somebody will try to make money from it. So my own view is this is fluid. It has to be allowed to generate, evolve over time. Mumbai today, and after the new infrastructure that we have just put in with the new metro line, the thing, will be able to put up, would be able to keep a lot more people comfortably living than would have been the case before this infrastructure was built. So we should allow for wherever possible FSIs to be allowed to go up. The point is, how much infrastructure are you building and what is its capacity to deal with the increase in concentration you're creating? And can you then create enough open spaces, etc., that human beings need for having whatever, connect with the ground? So my own view is that there is no, I mean, Indian cities, as I pointed out to you, are not concentrated enough in many cases, including Mumbai. Okay? And in fact, just to go to a point about brownfield cities, much of our cities will be brownfield. And in fact, there, let me say, that there is massive scope for expanding our brownfield cities internally and concentrating them more. Every single major Indian city has large amounts of derelict land that should be redeployed, and I'll give you some examples of it. Kolkata's entire riverfront is essentially derelict warehouses, much of it owned, by the way, by the Kolkata Port Trust. Mumbai's entire eastern seaboard is the Mumbai Port Trust. We should redeploy this. The center of Kanpur happens to be the La Limli, and where hundreds of acres of old derelict mills. It should be redeployed. Redeployment of buildings is important. Redeployment of land is important, but redeployment even of old buildings is important. And whenever we do it, unfortunately in India we have, you know, some bizarre sentimental attachment even to some old use, just because it is the old use. Oh my God, this was a mill, now we will turn it into a mall. Even if it creates more jobs, it's somehow, back of our head, it's somehow a bad thing. We are having this right now in Delhi. You know, everybody got very agitated when we came up with this idea that North Block and South Block should be converted into the National Museum. But hello, you all go to the Louvre. The Louvre was originally a palace, then it became the finance ministry, now it is a museum. Nobody has a problem with that. But somehow the fact that a city is an organic place where, you know, places like Shastri Bhavan deserve to be torn down. It's a good thing. So they are evolving things. Yes, you need to preserve some parts of it which are, you know, valuable to keep. The rest of it needs to evolve. New infrastructure needs to be brought in. And yes, we need to concentrate it. And if you build the infrastructure for it, no concentration is high enough. And yes, if there are people who want to work very far away from the city, welcome to do so. Please do so. The city is not meant for you then, if you are able to work from somewhere far away. There are activities and people who prefer to live in these densities, so let those people live in them. If you think you can work from sitting on the beach in some village in Goa, great. But then the city is not what we are building for.
Fantastic conclusion. I'll ask the others to also, if Ambassador has found some new opportunities of business of Finland in India.
Well, not perhaps new, but I think this whole approach to sustainability with making sure that we start to use materials that will last a bit longer than, for example, the raw materials of cement is going to be crucial. We also need to make sure that the materials and resources that we use are charged to the cost that they actually have. So water, electricity, all the other materials must have realistic cost to reduce wastage. It's another question that then society must have means to help the poor people who maybe can't afford the costs. That's another thing. But to avoid wastage, we have to devise systems how we can deal with these costs. And I think in the future we will have to do it in real time. For example, for electricity and water. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Rajaji, any thoughts that you want to respond to the questions raised, or any thoughts that you are taking away from here?
Well, we have crossed the hard stop of 115. But definitely some ideas about urban design and whether we need to have new greenfield cities. Maybe for a service-oriented city, for residential and all, yes, the organic city can develop and cater to its demands. Sometimes the kind of manufacturing that we want to come to India and do that, there is demand for greenfield industrial spaces, and that is what we are trying to create. And definitely the overall ecosystem around the cities needs to be much better, needs to be improved. And my takeaway is that, if I can say for myself, is about the organic development and how can planning be brought to that organic development.
Thank you. Because we have crossed the hard stop, and the panelists have been very gracious to listen to the questions. I'll give up the wrap-up time and a quick sum up to my good friend Jagan.
Thank you. I'm not sure I can sum up the entire richness of the conversation, but maybe just a few points in response to some of the questions. I think that, and we work on infrastructure at the InfraVision Foundation, and one of the key sort of realities of infrastructure is age and obsolescence. And so the conundrum always is, do you build everything and wait for population that comes and uses the infrastructure? Do you build in a sort of incremental way? And that requires systems thinking, which is not very easy to manage because you need to control the conditions around this. So it will remain a big question actually with regard to water supply, sanitation, and other kinds of core infrastructure. How much do we build? Can we finance all of it at one go, and so on? I think to Dr. Ashma Krishna's question on census towns, I would, much as I like the idea that concentration and dispersal will both operate, of course, but it depends on the distances between the dispersed parts. So we have, for instance, the National Capital Region plan talks about polynucleated development, sort of, so that's a kind of dispersal as well. But if it is peri-urban, then it actually impinges on the existing city and actually imposes a lot of burden on the city, because the jobs are still in the primate city and everybody from the peri-urban is actually commuting into CBDs and such like. So again, that's a systems view that we need to form and really take a call on that. And I'd like to just close with flagging, the terrible lack of capacity in our urban local bodies. You raised that point, and I think it needs to have a much larger national debate, because far from having a planner or an urban designer, Sanjeev, municipalities don't even have enough engineers or accountants to manage their affairs. So we have a severe problem with regard to capacities in municipal bodies. And we have to find a way to fix this problem. We have 1/20th the amount of capacity on ground as an average American city might have of comparable size. And we simply can't manage our cities in that way. And we don't have important skills like planning and design and so on, which are necessary now to look at the future of cities. So I'll close with that somewhat sobering thought, that we don't have the sufficient capacity. But I must say, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs is once again trying to build a strategy on capacity. I'm part of a working group that's looking at the issue, and now to look at digital, delivery of knowledge and skilling through digital platforms, perhaps, might be the way to go. But we have to fix this problem. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Sanyal. Thank you, Mr. Shah, and thank you, Mr. Saini, for a phenomenal session, and thank you for the audience. We have a lot of thought to take forward in our future discourses on cities. Thank you.
Yes, a loud round of applause, please, for all our panelists. CB, may I request you to hand over a token of appreciation to each one of them, please? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll break for lunch now. Lunch is at the same place it was yesterday at the Rajabagh. And we look forward to having you reconvene here at 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock here for the next session, post-lunch. Thank you very much for being with us.